Good evening, wanderers of the midnight hours. You found your way here, to a quiet corner where the world slows, where silence gathers at the edge of your bed, and where the shadows whisper just loud enough to be heard. Tonight, I'll guide you through 7 stories, 7 journeys into the strange, the uncanny, and the places where dream and waking life blur. So, close your eyes, sink into the dark, and follow me into the quiet places where the night waits. Story 1. The House That Waits. The house did not look unusual at first. It sat quietly at the edge of a suburban street. Its siding faded to the color of dried bone. The porch rail chipped where years of hands had leaned against it. A narrow yard, overgrown with brittle grass, led up to the steps. From the road it was one of many houses. No better, no worse. Unremarkable in every way except one. The rent was absurdly cheap. Clara told herself that was why she signed the lease so quickly. It was practical, temporary, just a place to stay during the long weeks before her exams. She would live quietly, alone, far from the noise of the campus dorms, nothing more. And yet, as she carried the first box across the threshold, she felt the faintest shiver, as though she had walked not into a house but into the memory of one. The air smelled faintly of dust and lavender, like drawers left too long unopened. The rooms were bare, except for the faint outlines on the walls, where pictures had once hung, pale rectangles surrounded by darker paint. The silence pressed in, heavy, almost expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. That first night she kept the lights on longer than necessary, pacing the small rooms, testing doors, tapping on windows. Everything worked. The faucets groaned but produced water. The locks clicked into place. It was simply an old house, nothing more. And yet, when she finally settled into bed with her notes stacked neatly beside her, she thought she heard something from the hallway. Not a noise exactly, but the suggestion of weight shifting, of boards creaking in a pattern too measured to be the house settling. Clara lay still, listening, her eyes fixed on the doorway. After a long moment, silence returned, complete and unbroken. She told herself it was nothing, that she was tired, that the house was simply old. But when she drifted at last into sleep, her final thought was not of exams or notes or deadlines. It was of how strange it felt to be the only person living in a place that seemed, somehow, already occupied. By the second week, the house had begun to feel almost comfortable. Clara's books filled the shelves. Her clothes softened the sharp smell of old wood, and her small desk faced the window where the afternoon light spilled in pale gold. She told herself she was settling in, adjusting, making this quiet place her own. But then came the small things. Not wrong, not threatening, just slightly off. The first time she noticed it was with her notes. She had left them in a scattered pile across the desk, scribbled pages of formulas and outlines, half-finished thoughts. When she returned from a walk, they were neatly stacked, corners aligned, as if she had taken the time to arrange them before leaving. She frowned, trying to recall if perhaps she had done it without thinking. The next morning, the blanket she always kicked aside in her restless sleep was tucked carefully around her shoulders. Too careful, almost deliberate, as though someone had watched the way she shifted at night and had chosen the exact moment to smooth the folds. She woke warm, cocooned, unsure whether to be grateful or unsettled. Each day brought another detail. A mug rinsed and placed upside down to dry, though she swore she had left it on the table. A book she had been reading closed and returned to the shelf, its bookmark placed with exact precision between the pages. A pair of shoes by the door, nudged closer together as if lined up for inspection. Clara laughed it off at first. She told herself she was simply forgetful, too consumed by study. She was tired, distracted, that was all. But there was something about the way the house seemed tidier, cared for, not by her but for her. At night she lay awake longer, listening to the silence, waiting for the creak of movement in the hallway. Sometimes she thought she heard it, faint as breath, a single step on wood, then nothing. The house always returned to its hush, as though unwilling to be caught in the act. One evening, while reviewing a chapter by lamplight, she felt it most clearly. That presence, not malicious, not heavy, simply there, as though someone stood just out of sight, quietly attentive, making sure she did not overwork herself, making sure she stayed warm, stayed fed, stayed safe. She should have been comforted, Instead, a faint unease spread through her chest, the way one might feel when realizing a stranger has been watching from across the room for longer than you thought possible. Still, the house waited. Still it tended. And when Clara finally drifted to sleep, the sound of paper shifting in the next room lulled her deeper, like the hand of someone tucking her in. Clara began to wonder if the house was shaping itself around her sleep. Every morning she woke rested, though she could not remember the dreams that had carried her through the night. Only fragments lingered, images of pale walls stretching higher than they should, a stairwell curving upward into darkness, a sense of being guided gently from room to room by a hand that never touched her. By day, she told herself these were only dreams, stitched together from long hours of study and the hush of the old rooms. But when she closed her eyes at night, she felt herself slipping not into sleep but into the house itself, as though it opened wider when the world outside fell silent. There was one dream she could not shake. She walked through the hallway, barefoot, and each door opened before her with a faint sigh, revealing rooms she had never seen. A nursery with a rocking chair swaying, though no one sat in it. A dining room set for 6, plates gleaming, though she lived alone. At the end of the hall, a bedroom where the covers were folded back as if waiting for her. She had the distinct impression that if she stepped into that bed, she would never wake in her own again. She startled awake to find herself standing in her real hallway, her hand hovering inches from her own closed door. The moonlight fell in soft silver through the window, and the silence of the house felt heavier than ever, like breath drawn in but never released. That was the first night she decided to stay awake, to watch instead of dream. She left the lamp burning low, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and lay still, her eyes open to the dark. For hours, she listened to the soft ticking of the clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, her own breathing steady and shallow. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The house was silent. But sometime past 3, her vision blurred. Her thoughts drifted, and in that space between waking and sleep, she heard it. The faint slide of fabric, the sound of something being folded, smoothed. Her notes, perhaps, or the blanket at her feet. She tried to lift her head, but her body felt weighted, pinned in place by the hush of the room. When her eyes fluttered open again, she was no longer in bed. She was in the parlor of her dreams, the one with the nursery and the endless doors. Only this time the walls pulsed faintly, as if the house were alive, breathing slow and deep around her. She walked, or thought she did. Each step seemed to last forever, carrying her farther from herself. And always, just at the edge of vision, there was someone with her, not a figure exactly, more like the outline of presence, a shadow with no body, guiding her from room to room. She felt both comforted and terribly, terribly alone. When she woke with the dawn, her notes were stacked again, the blanket folded at the foot of the bed, her shoes aligned neatly by the door. She had no memory of doing any of it. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps she had not been dreaming at all. The nights that followed grew softer at the edges, as though sleep was no longer a state she entered but a mist that rose slowly around her. Clara would sit at her desk late, the lamp's glow falling across her papers, and she would blink only once before finding herself elsewhere, still at the desk, still in the same chair, but with the room stretched wider, the corners retreating farther into shadow. Sometimes she caught sight of herself from across the room, a duplicate hunched over the desk, lips moving soundlessly, as though reciting lessons she did not know. She would turn her head and the vision would dissolve, leaving only her own reflection in the darkened glass of the window, breathing slightly out of sync with her. She began to hear music, not loud, not sharp, but a faint lull of piano keys struck slowly, as if someone were practicing a piece they could never quite remember. The melody slipped in and out of her consciousness, surfacing only when her mind drifted, never when she tried to listen directly. It reminded her of something half forgotten from childhood, a sound she associated with comfort, though here it came tinged with unease, as though each note was being pressed for her alone. And the rooms no longer held their shape. The kitchen stretched impossibly long, cupboards multiplying along the wall like mirrors repeating an image. The hallway doubled back on itself so that she walked in circles, her footsteps soft against the boards that seemed too patient beneath her weight. Doors that should have opened to closets revealed staircases spiraling downward into air so cold it made her teeth ache. She would blink, and the world would right itself. The kitchen narrow, the hallway short, the doors unremarkable. Yet the feeling remained that the house was showing her two versions of itself, one dressed for the daylight, one bare and truer in the half-light of exhaustion. Clara kept telling herself these were dreams, nothing more than dreams, but the evidence of her mornings betrayed her. Papers stacked with a precision she did not have, laundry folded with a neatness she never bothered with. Even her shoes by the door polished faintly, as though the house wanted her to leave only if she looked presentable enough to be seen. On one particular night, she found herself in the dream parlor again, the endless corridor of doors stretching into silence. Only this time one of the doors stood open. She did not recall approaching it, yet there she was, close enough to see the sliver of a room beyond. A bedroom, nearly identical to her own, except for one detail, the figure in the bed. It lay turned toward the wall, hair falling across the pillow, shoulders rising and falling with slow breath. She could not see the face, yet she knew with sick certainty that it was her, asleep, waiting, unaware of being watched. The urge to step closer was overwhelming. She reached for the doorframe, but the wood felt wrong, spongy, damp, as though it were flesh rather than timber. She recoiled, and in that moment the figure in the bed stirred, turning slightly, as if sensing her gaze. She woke on the floor beside her own bed, her hand pressed flat against the wall, palm damp with something that was not sweat. Clara decided she had had enough of half-light visions and scattered memories. If the house truly was arranging itself around her, if some unseen hand was smoothing her blankets, stacking her notes, guiding her through its shifting corridors, then she would see it. She would not let herself drift again into that soft blur where everything seemed to dissolve into dream. She prepared herself carefully. That night she left the lamp burning low, the pages of her textbook spread deliberately untidy across the desk, her blanket pushed to the far end of the bed. She lay down fully clothed, her eyes closed but her mind taut with waiting. Each breath she took was measured, deep, the rhythm of someone sinking into sleep. The hours passed in silence. At first she thought the plan had failed, that nothing would come, that the house would remain still under her watch. But sometime near the middle of the night, when her body had grown numb from stillness and her thoughts had begun to fray, she heard it, the faint scuff of movement. It was not the groan of old beams nor the crackle of settling wood. It was a step, deliberate and careful, from the hallway into her room. Clara's breath caught, but she forced it to remain steady. Her eyelids closed to a sliver. Through her lashes, she saw the dim outline of her desk, her papers still scattered. Then, slowly, impossibly gently, a shape bent over them. The air shifted, as if someone had leaned close, the faintest suggestion of fabric brushing wood. One by one, the pages lifted, straightened, aligned into a perfect stack. The pencil rolled an inch before being set carefully across the top. The figure was difficult to see, not because the room was dark, but because it seemed to lack weight, to shimmer faintly at the edges as though Clara's eyes refused to hold it in focus. It moved with an unhurried care, neither fully present nor entirely absent, and yet its attention was absolute. When it turned toward the bed, Clara felt every hair along her arms rise. The blanket at her feet stirred, lifted, drawn upward by invisible hands. She fought the urge to shiver as the weight settled over her, tucked in smooth lines along her body, pulled snug against her shoulders. The presence lingered there. She could feel it, hovering above her, watching with a silence that seemed to press against her skin. Her heart hammered, threatening to betray her stillness. For a terrible moment she thought it would lean closer, that it would bend over her face and she would feel its breath, see what she had never wanted to see. But then it moved away, slow, deliberate, as though satisfied. The sound of a footstep retreated into the hall. Clara waited until the gray light of morning touched the curtains before daring to open her eyes fully. The papers were stacked neatly. The blanket was smoothed, every corner folded tight. She sat up trembling, realizing she had finally seen what she had both dreaded and longed to prove. She was not alone in this house. For the rest of that morning, Clara tried to convince herself she had dreamed it, that she had been too far gone into exhaustion to know whether the sound of footsteps was real, whether the hands that folded her blanket had truly touched the air. But every time she glanced at the desk, at the way her papers sat in perfect symmetry, a quiet dread pressed against her chest. She had left them scattered. She remembered the untidiness, remembered the decision to make them so, and yet here they were in order that belonged to someone else. She spent the day moving slowly through the rooms, studying the corners as though they might reveal what had moved in the night. The air felt thick, as if the house itself were waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to acknowledge what she had witnessed. She tried to study, but the words blurred into meaningless lines. Her attention caught on every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow at the edge of her vision. By evening, the house had grown impossibly quiet. Not peaceful, not restful quiet in the way of something holding its breath. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed muted, as though the walls had swallowed it. Clara walked from room to room with the sensation that each doorway closed behind her just a second later than it should, as if the house were sealing her in. When night came, she told herself she would not sleep. She sat at her desk with the lamp turned low, eyes fixed on her notes, willing herself to stay alert. But the silence deepened until it seemed to pool around her, thick and soft, dragging at her eyelids. She began to feel as though the house itself were lulling her, rocking her gently toward unconsciousness, coaxing her with that same patient care it showed when smoothing her blankets, aligning her shoes. At some point she realized she was no longer certain whether she was awake. The room seemed unchanged, but the air shimmered faintly, the shadows at the edge of her vision lengthening as though stretching closer. A door she did not recall leaving open now stood ajar, its darkness deeper than it should have been. She blinked, and it was shut again. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts slow, yet a sliver of clarity remained, telling her that she must not drift, that if she surrendered even for a moment, the house would take more than she intended to give. But then came the sound again, the faint slide of fabric, the weight of presence near her shoulder. It lingered long enough that she felt the hairs rise along the back of her neck. And though she forced herself not to move, not to breathe too sharply, she could swear something leaned close enough to brush the air beside her ear. The whisper was not words, not even a sound she could name. It was the suggestion of breath itself, a sigh that seemed to say, "You are not alone. You have never been alone." When the whisper faded, the silence returned, denser than before, and Clara sat frozen, unsure whether the house had retreated or simply drawn closer than ever. The days blurred. Clara could not say when she had last left the house, or if the streets outside still existed in any shape she remembered. The textbooks lay unopened for hours, her notes untouched, yet somehow they were always stacked, tidy, waiting for her each morning. Time itself began to feel arranged, polished smooth by unseen hands, as though the house had taken even the hours into its careful order. At night, the boundary between waking and dreaming thinned to nothing. She would lie down and blink, and the room would seem unchanged, same walls, same shadows, yet a faint shift in the air told her she was elsewhere, in the deeper version of the house. The doors stood taller, the ceilings higher, the corners darker, as though revealing their true proportions when no one else was watching. She began to wander these dreamlike halls without fear of getting lost, for the house seemed to guide her with gentle insistence. Doors opened before she reached them, curtains stirred though there was no wind, drawing her attention toward staircases she did not recall. Each step she took echoed faintly, and she could not tell if the sound belonged to her or to something following just a pace behind. One night she found herself in a hallway she had never seen, lined with mirrors from floor to ceiling. Each reflected her, but not quite. One stood taller, one thinner, one with hair falling in a direction opposite her own, one with eyes too dark, one with a face too still. As she moved, they moved too, but a half-second late, as if they were considering whether to follow at all. She lingered before the last mirror, watching the reflected Clara smooth her blanket with slow, deliberate care. When she blinked, she was back in her bed, tucked neatly, her own hand lying motionless on the quilt. She told herself she should be afraid, yet what she felt most strongly was an odd, almost tender familiarity, as though the house had been watching her long enough to learn her habits, to mirror them back until they were no longer hers alone. But sometimes, in the fragile hour before dawn, when shadows blurred against the pale window, she caught herself thinking a thought that did not feel like her own. "You are safe here. You are cared for. You belong to me now." The voice was not loud, not even spoken. It was the quiet assurance of walls leaning close, of floorboards holding steady, of air that shaped itself to her breath, a voice without sound, wrapping itself around her mind like a blanket she had not asked for, but could not throw aside. And when she tried to imagine leaving, packing her things, stepping back through the front door, the thought dissolved like smoke, impossible to hold. It was easier to lie back, to close her eyes, to let the house continue its careful tending. Yet beneath that gentle patience, she felt something else stirring, something waiting for her to turn fully toward it, to stop pretending she did not see, something that had lingered long enough, and would remain until she looked directly into its faceless gaze. That night, the air was different, heavy, expectant, as if the house itself had grown tired of waiting for her compliance. Clara lay in bed with the blanket pulled to her chin, eyes closed, breath steady, pretending once again to drift into sleep. But beneath her stillness, every nerve hummed with a taut awareness. She knew it was coming. She knew it would no longer content itself with tidying papers and smoothing sheets. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, until even the faint ticking of the clock seemed swallowed whole. And then, the sound began. A step in the hallway, deliberate, slow. Another, closer. The faint sigh of the door easing wider. Clara kept her eyes closed, though her lashes trembled. She could feel the shift of weight in the room, the subtle indentation of air as something moved toward her. The floorboard beside her bed groaned softly, not with age but with pressure, as if a body stood there, patient, watching. She could not resist. Her eyes opened the smallest fraction, enough to see the outline leaning over her. It was not shadow, not light, but something in between, a shape blurred at the edges, without a face, without detail, as though her mind refused to resolve it. And yet the intent was clear. It bent over her, close enough that she could feel the hush of its presence on her skin. Her breath faltered. For the first time, she wanted to speak, to break the silence with words that might reclaim some control. But her throat refused. The air was too thick, pressing down, filled with the weight of an unseen stare. The figure's head tilted, as though examining her. One invisible hand rose not quite solid, but not nothing either, and brushed the edge of her blanket, drawing it tighter across her body. She felt the motion like a ripple through water, the suggestion of contact without touch, and then the hand lingered at her shoulder, hovering inches from her skin, trembling with an intimacy that made her chest ache. Clara could not bear it. Her eyes flew open fully, and for the first time she looked directly at it. The faceless outline loomed above, pulsing faintly, as though made of breath and shadow. Where a face should have been was a hollow blur, a shifting void that seemed to drink the light. And yet, impossibly, she knew it was looking back at her, studying her with the same patient care it had shown all along. Her scream caught in her throat. She could not move, could not breathe. The figure leaned closer, the void where its face should be pressed nearer to hers, until the world narrowed to the cold presence above her bed. And then, in the hollow of her skull, a voice whispered without words, without sound, but unmistakable. "Now you see me. Now you understand. You are mine." The lamp flickered. The room warped at the edges. Clara's vision dissolved into darkness that was not sleep, not dream, but the house itself swallowing her whole. Story 2. The voice on the answering machine. It had been years since David had last seen a cassette answering machine, the kind with tiny spools of brown tape, the kind that clicked softly when a message began to play, the kind that belonged to another decade entirely. He found it one gray afternoon while unpacking boxes in the apartment he had just rented, tucked into the back of a cabinet coated in a thin film of dust. The machine was heavy in his hands, the plastic yellowed with age, the buttons stiff when pressed. A faint smell of metal and ozone clung to it, like the air just after a storm. For a moment he considered throwing it away. It was useless, outdated, a relic no one had reason to keep. But something about the weight of it, the way it seemed to hum faintly, even without power, made him hesitate. He set it on the kitchen counter, plugged it into the wall, and to his surprise the machine whirred softly to life. The little red light blinked twice, then steadied. There was already a tape inside. David stared at it, torn between curiosity and a faint unease he could not name. This apartment was supposed to be empty, the previous tenant long gone. Whatever messages remained would be nothing more than scraps of another life, mundane echoes of strangers, wrong numbers, telemarketers, a friend calling about dinner. That was all. And yet, as the tape began to spin and the first message crackled into the air, the room felt colder. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, low and trembling. "Please, she whispered. Please pick up. I don't know where I am. I think someone is outside. A pause, a muffled sound, as if she had turned suddenly toward the receiver, whispering faster now. They keep knocking. They won't leave. Please, if you hear this, call me back. Please. The message clicked off. The tape whirred, then advanced to the next. Another message, the same voice. This time sharper, almost panicked. Why won't you answer? Why aren't you there? They're closer now. I can hear them. Please, please. The machine clicked again. David's finger hovered over the stop button, but he didn't press it. His body felt rigid, transfixed, as though the voice itself had pinned him in place. The third message began with silence. A long, dragging silence. Then the faint sound of sobbing. A whisper, barely audible. They know I'm alone. The tape ended with a hiss of static. David stood in the quiet kitchen, the machine humming faintly on the counter, the little red light still glowing. He told himself it was nothing but an old tape, a forgotten relic, a woman's voice from decades past that no longer mattered. But the words echoed in the stillness, and he could not shake the feeling that, whoever she was, she had spoken not to the past, but to him. That night David tried to sleep, but the apartment did not feel empty the way it had when he first carried his boxes across the threshold. The room seemed to hold a weight now, as though the air itself had thickened with the residue of voices. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint red glow of the machine's light seeping under the crack of the bedroom door, pulsing in the dark like a slow, patient heartbeat. He thought he could hear it still, even with the machine silent. That voice. Not words exactly, just the cadence of someone whispering to be heard, a fragile rhythm of breath and syllable that seemed to weave itself into the hush of the night. Each time he shifted beneath the blanket, he caught it again, a whisper just at the edge of recognition. When he did fall asleep, his dreams were filled with telephones. They rang endlessly in empty rooms, rotary dials spinning of their own accord, cords coiled like snakes across the floor. He would lift a receiver and hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing, only to realize it was not his breathing at all, but hers, the woman from the tape, waiting on the line. At one point in the dream, he found himself standing in his own kitchen, though it seemed larger, deeper. The shadows pooled in corners he did not recognize. The answering machine sat on the counter, its spools turning, the tape whispering without pause. He leaned closer, and for a moment he thought he could see her reflected faintly in the machine's plastic window. A blur of hair, eyes too wide, lips trembling as she spoke. He woke with a start, the dawn pale and cold across the blinds. The machine was still where he had left it, quiet, its red light steady, unblinking. He told himself it was nothing, only a dream. Yet as he crossed the kitchen to make coffee, he noticed the tape had wound backward, as if rewound by a careful hand. And faintly, beneath the hum of the refrigerator, he could swear he heard the soft click of a play button being pressed. Over the next few nights, David began to notice the apartment had developed its own kind of rhythm, not the normal creaks and sighs of an old building, but something more deliberate, as if the walls themselves adjusted when he moved from room to room, as though the space was aware of his steps. When he paused too long in silence, the quiet seemed to lean in, pressing closer, like someone holding their breath and waiting for him to speak first. The machine remained on the counter, its red light steady, and David found himself watching it more often than he wanted. Sometimes, when he looked away and then back again, he could have sworn the light had dimmed and then brightened, like an eyelid half closed before snapping open. Once, late at night, he was certain he heard the faint scrape of tape moving, though the reels remained still. Sleep became shallow, and the boundary between waking and dreaming blurred further. He would close his eyes and drift, only to find himself standing barefoot in the kitchen again, the machine humming, its voice spilling out in whispers too soft to make out. He strained to listen, leaning close, and then realized the sound was not coming from the speaker at all but from the air behind him, as though someone were bent to his ear. In these half-dreams, the apartment always appeared slightly wrong. The angles stretched longer, doorways taller, as if the place were revealing its hidden proportions. The kitchen window opened not onto the alley he knew, but onto a void, pale and endless, in which a single telephone booth stood. Its receiver dangled, swinging gently as though someone had just let go. David would step toward it, drawn by a thread he could not name, only to wake in his bed with the sound of the swinging cord still echoing faintly in his ears. He began to feel watched, though not with malice, more like anticipation. The way a phone waits to be answered, the way silence waits to be broken. At times he caught himself whispering, "Hello?" into the empty air, as though prompted, and the moment after the word left his lips, the refrigerator would hum louder, or the floorboards would shift, as if the apartment had responded in kind. One dawn, as light bled through the blinds, he found himself already sitting at the kitchen table, though he could not recall leaving his bed. The answering machine was in front of him, closer than he had placed it, its tape wound to the beginning. He pressed nothing, yet the reels stirred, trembling, as if they had been waiting for him to wake before continuing their message. And in the hush of that fragile morning, David felt certain the machine was no longer replaying something from the past. It was waiting to speak again, this time to him directly. By the fourth night, David no longer turned the machine off. He had stopped trying to convince himself it was a useless relic. Instead, he left it plugged in, the red light glowing across the dark kitchen like a sentinel. It became part of the apartment's rhythm, the single fixed point in a space that no longer felt entirely his own. When he moved through the rooms, he sometimes thought he could hear a faint click behind him, as if a recording had begun the moment he left a doorway. The sensation grew so strong that he caught himself whispering to the silence, speaking half-thoughts aloud, the way one might when they know a tape is running. Small fragments of confession, muttered reassurances to no one in particular. He would laugh nervously afterward, shake his head, but the habit returned each time the silence pressed too heavily. The dreams deepened. Always the same apartment, but wrong. Always the same machine, but older, darker, humming like a living thing. In one dream, he found the tape spools empty, unspooling themselves across the floor, thin ribbons winding into the hallway and beneath the bedroom door. He followed them and found the strands leading to his own bed, the tape wrapped carefully around the shape of a sleeping body, his body bound like an offering. Another night he dreamt of the phone booth again, the one that stood in the pale void beyond his window. This time the receiver was lifted, held by a hand that disappeared into the fog. He could not see the figure, only the suggestion of movement, the faint outline of someone waiting on the other end. When the receiver turned slightly, David had the sickening impression that it was angled toward him, inviting him to respond. Waking brought no relief. He began to notice details that unsettled him more than the dreams themselves. The tape inside the machine was no longer at the same point when he rose each morning. Sometimes it had wound forward, sometimes backward, as though someone had been replaying moments of a conversation he could not hear. Once, in the gray light before dawn, he swore he heard the click of the record button pressing down, though he had not touched it. And then came the morning when he found his own voice on the tape. Just a few seconds murmured, slurred, as if caught between waking and sleep. "Hello, is anyone there?" He played it again and again, hoping it was his imagination, a trick of static, a distortion. But the cadence was his, the weariness in the tone, the exact catch in the breath. It was him, speaking to someone who had not answered. The machine whirred softly as the tape ended, the red light steady and unblinking, and David sat frozen, realizing he could no longer tell whether the device was playing back what had been, or recording what was still to come. It was the fifth night when the ringing started, not from the machine, not from the phone on the wall, but from everywhere at once, a sound so thin and metallic that David thought for a moment it was only in his head. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and realized the sound was threading itself through the apartment like wire, vibrating through the floorboards, slipping along the walls. It was unmistakably a telephone ring, but not the modern tone. This was older, heavier, the hollow chime of a rotary phone from decades past, the kind you felt more than heard. It rang twice, then fell silent, leaving the air sharp and waiting. David stumbled into the kitchen. The answering machine sat quietly on the counter, its red light unwavering. No messages, no movement. Yet as he reached for it, the ringing began again, closer this time, as though a phone had been placed directly in the room with him. He turned toward the sound and found nothing. Only the counter, the shadows, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The ringing stopped. And then, impossibly, the machine clicked. The reels stirred. The speaker hissed softly, alive again without his touch. "Hello?" The woman's voice, raw, desperate. "Please, I don't know how long I can." Static swallowed her words. David's breath came shallow, his hand trembling above the stop button, but he could not press it. The machine whirred and continued, the tape moving steadily, though no tape should have held her now. The voice returned, broken by interference. "They're still here. I can hear them. Outside the door." Silence. Then the faintest knock. Not from the machine, not from the tape, but from the far side of his own front door. He froze. The knock came again. Slow. Patient. Exactly as she had described. David's skin prickled. He wanted to believe it was coincidence, a neighbor, someone passing, but the rhythm of it was wrong. Too measured. Too deliberate. He forced himself to the door, pressed his eye to the peephole. The hallway stretched empty. Behind him, the machine clicked once more. The tape whined, stopped, then resumed, as if skipping to another place entirely. And this time, it was his own voice that spilled into the kitchen. "Please," he heard himself say. "Please, someone pick up." The words were low, cracked, like they had been dragged from him in another life, or another night he had not yet lived. The tape clicked off. The red light steadied. The apartment fell silent again, leaving David alone in the stillness, staring at a machine that seemed to know his future before he lived it. That night, David did not return to bed. He sat in the kitchen with the answering machine before him. The tape silent now, the reel still, but the memory of the ringing lingered, stretching across the hours, so vivid he almost believed it could begin again at any moment. The red light glowed steadily, reflecting faintly in the window above the sink, a second pulse floating in the dark glass. He dozed at the table, head heavy on his arms, and when his eyes closed, the sound returned, slipping into his dreams like a thread pulled tight. The ring was slower this time, each note drawn out until it seemed to bleed into the walls. He walked through the apartment in the dream, searching for the source. But each doorway only opened into another hallway, each hallway into another set of stairs. And always, from somewhere ahead, the ringing continued. Sometimes it sounded close, just around the corner. Sometimes it echoed far away, muffled as though underwater. Yet when he reached the place where he thought the phone must be, there was only another corridor, another bend, another shadow stretching long across the floor. He began to feel that he was not chasing the sound at all, but being led by it, pulled deeper into a structure that had no end. At last he came to a narrow room with a single telephone on the floor, an old rotary model the color of bone. Its cord coiled across the tiles like something alive, twitching with each pulse of the ring. He reached for the receiver, but as his hand closed around it, the ringing stopped. The silence was so sudden it rang louder than the bell itself. He lifted the receiver anyway. No dial tone, no static, only his own breath. Then, faintly, a second breath, perfectly in time with his own, exhaling as he inhaled, inhaling as he exhaled. He held it there, paralyzed, listening to the rhythm that was not his, until he realized the voice on the other end was not waiting to speak but waiting for him to answer. He whispered, "Hello?" and woke instantly, sitting upright at the table. The kitchen was gray with the first edge of dawn. The answering machine sat still, its tape unchanged, its light unwavering. But in his hand, cold and slick with sweat, was the telephone receiver. The cord dangled across the table, stretching back to the machine itself. David dropped it as though burned. The receiver struck the wood with a dull thud, and yet no matter how many times he told himself it wasn't possible, he swore he could still hear the faint echo of a ring, trailing away into silence that would not last. David avoided sleep the following night, but wakefulness felt no safer. He sat in the dim kitchen, the answering machine's red eye fixed on him like a patient observer, and tried to read, to write, to do anything that might ground him. Yet each time he looked up from the page, he was certain the shadows had rearranged themselves. The machine seemed to lean closer, as though its cord stretched just slightly farther across the counter, seeking him out. At some point the ringing began again, not loud, not sharp, but soft, muffled, as though buried beneath layers of walls. It pulsed faintly, fading in and out, and every time it stopped he held his breath, waiting for silence to settle. But the silence never lasted. The ring always returned, as though it had never ceased, as though he had simply failed to hear it in the pause. He wandered the apartment in this state, half listening, half dreaming. The ring echoed through the bathroom pipes, rattled faintly in the radiator, hummed in the glass of the windows. Even when he pressed his hands over his ears, the sound remained inside him, vibrating in his chest like another heartbeat. Then, Between two of the rings, a voice seeped through, not from the machine, not from the walls, from the space just behind his ear. Pick up. The word was barely a breath, fragile as a sigh, yet it froze him in place. He turned sharply, but there was no one in the room, only the answering machine. It's real still. Another pause, another ring, then the whisper again. Please. David pressed his palms to the counter, his breath ragged, fighting the urge to answer aloud. He felt that if he gave even a single syllable, something would step fully into the silence, something that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. The apartment shifted around him in subtle ways. The hallway seemed longer, the ceiling lower, the kitchen window dark, though the streetlights should have been visible. He wondered whether he was walking at all or only dreaming himself through spaces that no longer obeyed their own design. The next time the ring came, it was already inside the room, loud enough that he thought the phone must be on the table in front of him, and with it, not a whisper but a voice clearer than before, a woman's voice trembling with urgency. David, I know you hear me. His stomach clenched. The machine had never spoken his name. Not once. The red light blinked. Once. Twice. As if agreeing. By the sixth night, the apartment no longer held silence at all. It was filled instead with the murmur of something just beneath hearing, the constant suggestion of words caught behind the walls. David would stand in the hallway and feel them bleeding through the plaster, soft, fragmented syllables that swelled and faded like breath pressed against the seams of the building. He told himself they were pipes, the groan of water, the old bones of the structure shifting. But sometimes, when he leaned close, he could make out the cadence of a sentence, not full but enough to know it had shape. Don't leave. Stay. Answer me. The hallway grew stranger each time he crossed it. The light at one end flickered faintly, though it had burned steady before, and the floor seemed longer, stretching into shadows that swallowed more than they should. At night, when the rest of the apartment lay quiet, he sometimes heard footsteps there, unhurried, patient, walking toward him though no one ever appeared. On the seventh night, as he lay on the couch unwilling to sleep, the voices gathered all at once. Not from the machine, not from the phone, but directly around him, filling the air with a low collective whisper. It was not chaotic, it was organized, a chorus rising and falling in waves, as though reciting lines from a script he could not yet understand. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound was inside, vibrating in the hollow of his skull. Then, beneath the chorus, he heard the woman again, clearer than ever, not on tape, not through static. Her voice moved through the hallway itself, as though she were standing just around the corner. David, she said, soft but certain. Don't let them in. He stumbled toward the hall, compelled by equal parts dread and recognition. The shadows pressed deeper there, the bulbs overhead flickering with every step he took. And though he told himself he would find nothing, that it was only his exhausted mind bending to fear, he could see just at the far end the suggestion of a figure. Not solid, not defined, but a smear of darkness shaped almost like a woman, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. The figure raised a hand, not in warning, not in greeting, but as if pressing invisible fingers to her lips. And all at once, the answering machine in the kitchen clicked to life. The reels turned, the tape whirred, and his own voice spilled out again. Please, it said. Please, they're at the door. Babbed. The hallway light snapped out, plunging the corridor into perfect darkness. David did not move at first. He stood at the mouth of the hallway, the darkness pooling before him, and tried to convince himself that nothing was there, that the shadow at the far end was no more than a trick of weak light. Yet the longer he stared, the less certain he became of the walls themselves. The corridor seemed to breathe, to bend almost imperceptibly, its lines warping as though the building had grown tired of pretending to be a home. When he finally stepped forward, the floor creaked beneath him in a rhythm not his own. Each of his steps was echoed by another, half a beat delayed, as though someone walked just behind him, careful never to be caught. He stopped. The second set of footsteps stopped. He moved again. They followed, never overtaking, never retreating. The air thickened the deeper he went. The ceiling dipped low, the shadows folding downward like fabric heavy with unseen weight. He brushed his hand against the wall to steady himself, but the plaster no longer felt solid. It was soft, pliant, almost warm. like skin held too long beneath the sun. And still the whispers rose. Some were clear enough to parse his name, repeated gently, the word answer spoken again and again, while others dissolved before they formed, the syllables stretching into tones that blurred like voices underwater. At one point he thought he heard laughter, low and steady, the kind that carries not joy but recognition, as though something in the dark knew him far better than he knew himself. He turned his head, and for a fraction of a moment he thought he saw doors where there should have been none, thin frames set into the wall, some half open, revealing rooms filled with rotary phones ringing faintly in unison. The cords twisted together across the floors like veins, vanishing into the gloom. He blinked, and the doors were gone, the hallway seamless again, though the ringing still echoed faintly in his ears. By the time he reached the end of the corridor, he no longer trusted his sense of distance. The space had stretched impossibly long, the bulbs overhead dimming until they resembled stars in a collapsing sky. And there, at the edge of the dark, the figure remained, still tilted, still listening, but now she was joined by others, shapes just behind her, indistinct, as though the shadows themselves had begun to gather. They leaned together, their outlines wavering, as though deciding whether to remain hidden or step fully into the glow. David's breath hitched. The machine clicked again in the kitchen, a sound too sharp, too deliberate to be coincidence. The reel spun, and the hallway itself seemed to answer, the walls trembling with a voice that was neither hers nor his, but something vast and collective, whispering in unison, "Pick up, pick up, pick up, M." The chorus of whispers did not fade. It thickened until the air itself seemed woven from the words. David pressed his back to the wall, his breath shallow, his skin damp with a cold that came not from the night but from the weight of unseen mouths brushing the edges of his thoughts. The figure at the far end of the hall tilted her head further, as though urging him to step closer, to close the distance that the building had stretched into infinity. Behind him, the answering machine clattered. The reels spun with sudden violence, tape whining as though it might snap, the red light blinking in a fevered pulse. His own voice burst from the speaker, louder this time, frantic, barely recognizable as his. "Please, they're here now, please. Pick up." The words tangled with the chorus, overlapping until he could no longer tell whether they came from the machine, from the shadows, or from his own throat. He clamped his mouth shut, terrified that if he spoke, the building would claim the sound as its own and loop it back through the tape forever. The figure at the end of the hall raised her hand again, not to hush him this time, but to beckon. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if she had been waiting for years to make the gesture. And as her arm lifted, the others behind her leaned forward, their indistinct forms sharpening into faces half seen, half remembered, like photographs left too long in the sun. The whispers pressed harder. The walls groaned, and he felt the plaster give slightly under his palm, warm and wet, as if something just beneath the surface was breathing with him. He wanted to turn, to flee into the kitchen, to rip the machine from the wall and silence it forever. But the moment he shifted, the hallway deepened again, elongating into impossible distance, stretching like a tunnel whose far end opened not into another room but into something vast and waiting. The phone rang, not the soft, muffled pulse of before, but a single deafening peal that reverberated through the corridor and struck him like a physical blow. It rattled his bones, shook the breath from his lungs, and for an instant he thought the bulb above him would burst from the force of it. The woman's voice followed immediately, urgent, cutting through the cacophony. "David, don't let them answer for you." The words pierced him with a clarity that the others lacked, a single thread in the weave. But as he took a desperate step toward her, the shadows behind her surged, their forms leaning forward, their mouths opening in perfect unison, whispering a single word that filled every corner of the building. "Now." And from the kitchen, the machine obeyed. The tape clicked, the speaker hissed, and another voice his again, yet not his, answered the call. "Hello?" The sound of it froze him where he stood. It was his voice stripped of hesitation, confident, assured, as though another version of himself had already accepted the invitation. The line had been picked up, but not by him. The silence that followed was worse than the ringing. It stretched across the apartment like a sheet pulled taut, thin and trembling, waiting for the smallest disturbance to tear it open again. David stood frozen in the hallway, chest tight, his ears ringing with the echo of his own voice, his voice, but not his answering from the machine. For a moment, he thought he could still see the woman at the far end of the corridor, her silhouette blurred against the dark, her hand half raised in a gesture he could not read. But when he blinked, she was gone. Only the shadows remained, deep and ordinary, as though the apartment had been nothing more than walls and doors all along. He forced himself back into the kitchen. The machine sat quietly on the counter, its reels still, the red light steady, unwavering. No new messages, no sound. It looked inert, harmless, like any piece of outdated plastic left to gather dust. He almost believed it. Exhaustion carried him to bed at last, though his sleep was shallow, threaded with half-dreams of corridors and doorways that opened into more doorways. Each time he stirred, he thought he heard the faintest click from the kitchen, the suggestion of tape spooling in the dark. But when he rose to listen, the apartment greeted him only with silence. By morning, the air seemed lighter. The whispers had faded. The oppressive weight of the night dissolved in the pale wash of dawn. He told himself it was finished, that whatever he had experienced, whether dream, hallucination, or something he dared not name, had passed with the night. He made coffee, opened the blinds, and let the light spill across the kitchen. The machine sat there, quiet, patient. He did not touch it. Days passed. The apartment settled. He heard no more ringing, no more voices, only the hum of ordinary life filling the rooms once more. He began to sleep deeply again, to forget the peculiar dread that had haunted those nights. And then, one evening, as he returned from work, David found the machine waiting. Its light was steady, its reels still, but the tape inside had moved. The spool wound further along than he remembered leaving it. He stared at it for a long time, keys still in his hand, unwilling to cross the threshold into the kitchen. The air felt charged again, brittle, expectant. He told himself he would not press play. He would ignore it. But as he turned away, the machine clicked once sharp, deliberate like a throat clearing before speech. And faintly, from the speaker came the sound of his own footsteps, entering the apartment, closing the door, laying his keys upon the table. A perfect echo of the moment he was living now. David froze. His pulse hammered in his ears. The message ended abruptly, leaving only static, and then silence. The red light glowed, steady as a heartbeat, waiting. Story 3. The Whispers in the Orchard. Nora had always thought of her grandmother's orchard as a place of comfort. Rows of crooked apple trees stretched across the sloping land, their branches knotting together like clasped fingers, their roots drinking deeply from the soil that had been turned and tended by her family for generations. She had played there as a child, climbing until the bark tore at her knees, falling asleep in the shade with the smell of ripening fruit thick in the air. But after her grandmother passed and Nora returned to settle the property, the orchard felt different. The branches leaned closer now, as though listening. The shade pooled in unfamiliar ways, gathering too deep, too cold. Even in daylight, the orchard carried a hush, a low expectancy, as though it remembered something that Nora had forgotten. On the first night, she sat by the window of her grandmother's old room, unable to sleep. A breeze stirred the branches, but the leaves did not rustle. They seemed to shift in silence, their movement muffled, and faintly, beneath the quiet, Nora thought she heard voices. Not distinct, not words, but the low cadence of people murmuring just out of sight, the way a congregation whispers before a prayer begins. She told herself it was the wind funneling through the branches. She told herself it was nothing at all. But she found herself leaning toward the window, straining to catch a phrase, a name, a single syllable she could place. The orchard swayed gently in the dark, each tree bent as though in consultation with the next, and she felt suddenly certain that they were not speaking to each other, but to her. The old answering machine on her grandmother's bedside table clicked once, startling her. Nora turned sharply. She had forgotten the thing even existed, but its reels remained still, its light unlit. The sound, she decided, must have come from the pipes, or the house settling. But when she turned back to the orchard, one of the trees stood different from the rest. A tall apple tree near the center leaned at an odd angle, its trunk bent toward the house, its branches spread like arms reaching. For an instant, she thought she saw a shape at its base, a figure indistinct and waiting. The voices rose again, soft, coaxing, and this time she did not lean closer. She closed the blinds and forced herself into bed, her heart racing in a rhythm that did not quiet until dawn. That night, Nora drifted into sleep and woke again without ever feeling she had crossed the threshold between the two. One moment she was lying in her grandmother's bed, the quilt heavy against her chest. The next, she was standing barefoot in the orchard, the soil cool and damp beneath her feet, the rows of trees unfolding endlessly in every direction. The air smelled of apples overripe and rotting, their sweetness soured by something faintly metallic, like rust on water. The voices were clearer here. They rose and fell in the branches, a thousand whispers braided together, never fully forming words, yet never collapsing into noise. She turned in slow circles, convinced that if she faced the right direction, she would hear them distinctly, as though tuning a radio dial. The branches leaned toward her, creaking gently, their limbs drawn down like listeners eager to catch her reply. She walked between the rows, her fingers brushing the bark. The trees felt warmer than they should, and every time she touched one, the whisper nearest to her fell silent, as if pausing mid-thought. Then, when she withdrew her hand, the murmur resumed, softer, more intent. At the center of the orchard she found the leaning tree, its trunk bowed toward the house, its roots half exposed in the soil. At its base hung a swing she did not remember, a rough plank of wood suspended by ropes fraying at the ends. The seat swayed gently as though someone had only just left it, though the air was still. Nora reached out. The rope was damp, sticky, as though coated in sap, but when she drew her hand back, her palm shone faintly as if she had touched fresh ink. The shadows of the branches twisted above her, interlocking until they formed the vague outline of a ceiling, a roof, a chamber built entirely of wood and night. The whispers thickened. They no longer seemed distant but pressed directly against her ears, filling her with an intimacy that felt unbearable. She thought she heard her own name spoken once, twice, followed by a string of words she could almost but not quite understand. The swing moved again, more insistent this time, and for an instant she saw a figure seated there. Not a child, not an adult, only a blur of presence, head bowed, hair veiling its face. When she blinked, the seat was empty, drifting idly in the air. The orchard breathed. She could feel it, the earth rising and falling beneath her feet, the trees expanding and contracting as if they were lungs. She clutched at the nearest trunk for balance, her own breath staggering to match the rhythm. And then she woke, or thought she did, back in her grandmother's bed, the blinds still drawn, the room heavy with the hush of early morning. But her hand still bore the faint black stain of the rope, a print shaped like fingers pressed too tightly around her wrist. Morning came gray and muted, the kind of light that softened every edge without truly brightening the world. Nora carried her coffee to the porch and stared out at the orchard, expecting to feel foolish for her unease of the night before. Sunlight, she thought, would strip away the shadows, reduce the trees to what they had always been. Bark and fruit, roots and soil, nothing more. But the orchard looked wrong in daylight. The rows seemed uneven, their lines bending slightly as though the trees had shifted positions while she slept. Where she remembered clear gaps between trunks, there were now clusters, tight as if huddling together. The leaning tree in the center appeared closer, though she knew it had always stood far back near the slope. Its branches stretched wide, heavy with apples that seemed to hang lower than the rest, their skins dappled with dark spots that spread like bruises. Nora stepped down into the grass. The air was still, but the trees quivered faintly, each one swaying in its own rhythm, independent of any breeze. She told herself it was nothing, that orchards changed, that her memory exaggerated. But when she reached the first row, she noticed the ground beneath the trees was littered with fallen apples split open to reveal not pale flesh but cores blackened and wet, their seeds swollen, glistening like eyes that rolled in the light. The smell was sharp, fermented, almost intoxicating. She knelt to touch one, and the skin collapsed beneath her fingers, releasing a thin trickle of liquid that clung to her skin, sticky and dark. She wiped her hand on the grass, but the stain lingered, faintly tacky, as though it wanted to remain. Birdsong broke the silence suddenly, high and frantic, and she glanced up to see a crow perched on one of the branches. Its wings shivered, feathers flaring in agitation, but it did not caw. Its beak opened and closed soundlessly, as if the orchard had swallowed its voice. The sight unsettled her more than she expected. She turned quickly back toward the house, but the porch seemed farther than it had before, the rows of trees hemming her in. The leaning tree loomed in her periphery, always at the corner of her eye no matter how she turned her head, its branches thrust forward like arms ready to close around her. She forced herself to walk steadily, refusing to run. Each step through the grass felt heavy, dragging, as though the earth clung to her ankles. The whispers she had heard the night before did not return in full, but she thought she caught fragments, a sigh, the faint suggestion of her name woven faintly into the rustle of leaves. By the time she reached the porch, her chest was tight, her breath shallow. She turned once more to the orchard. The rows looked orderly again, the house no longer far. The leaning tree stood in its place, unmoving, innocent, but she knew it was watching, and the orchard was waiting. For the rest of the morning, Nora tried to lose herself in the ordinary rituals of the house, washing the old dishes, sweeping dust from corners, sorting through drawers filled with her grandmother's forgotten trinkets. Yet no matter what task she set her hands to, her attention drifted again and again to the windows. The orchard pressed against the glass like a sea of still bodies, each tree rooted in place but never quite still, their branches trembling faintly in the stark daylight. She told herself she was imagining it, that grief was turning familiar things strange. But the longer she watched, the more the orchard resembled a congregation, the rows of trunks like figures bowing, each canopy leaning toward the next, passing some wordless message along the line. In the bright sun, their bark looked pale, stretched, almost human, and she could not help but see the suggestion of faces in the knots, mouths caught mid-whisper. At midday, she stepped outside again. The light was harsh now, silver and flat, washing color from the grass. It should have brought clarity, but instead the orchard looked bleached, as if she had stepped into a photograph of a place she once knew rather than the place itself. Even her own shadow lay strangely thin, its outline trembling as though uncertain of its form. She walked toward the leaning tree, compelled without knowing why. The air grew cooler as she neared it, the shade too dense for noon. On its branches hung apples pale as bone, their surfaces smooth and gleaming like porcelain. She reached out and plucked one. Startled by the weight, it felt heavier than fruit should, solid and cold as stone. When she held it up to the light, the skin seemed almost translucent, and beneath it she glimpsed faint dark shapes shifting slowly, as though something inside pressed against the thin wall of flesh. Her stomach turned. She dropped the apple and stepped back. The fruit did not fall into grass, but landed with a dull, hollow sound, like wood striking wood, and rolled to a stop at the base of the tree. The branches stirred, though no wind moved them, and for a breathless instant she thought she saw lips parting among the leaves, pale mouths opening silently, waiting for her to lean closer. A sudden blaze of sunlight struck her eyes, sharp enough to make her stagger. She shielded her face, and when her vision cleared, the orchard looked ordinary again, branches heavy with red fruit, shadows lying quiet across the soil. The pale apples were gone. The whispering hushed. Nora hurried back toward the porch. Though the brightness of the day did not comfort her, she felt as though she had walked through a dream and woken inside another, the edges of each overlapping, blurring until she no longer knew which was meant to end. By dusk, the orchard had settled into silence again, but it was not the kind of silence that promised rest. It was the breath held too long, the stillness of a house waiting for the knock at its door. Nora lit a lamp in the kitchen and tried to busy herself with a book, though she found herself turning the same page again and again without ever reading the words. The air pressed close, thick with the scent of ripening fruit, drifting through the open windows. When night finally fell, it did so without a gradient. One moment the orchard was visible in the orange haze of sunset. The next it was gone, swallowed whole in blackness that seemed too complete for a rural night. The lamp's glow barely touched the edges of the room, as though the dark outside had pressed its face against the glass and would not let the light expand. And then the voices returned. They began faintly, like a current moving beneath the soil, a low vibration more felt than heard. Nora stood by the window, the blinds half drawn, and listened as the murmur swelled into words she could almost grasp. Closer. Here. With us. The orchard no longer whispered at a distance, it addressed her directly. She backed away, heart rattling against her ribs. The house felt smaller than before, each wall bending inward, as if to shepherd her toward the orchard. The old answering machine on the bedside table clicked once, though its light remained dark. The click was followed by a soft hiss, as though a tape had begun to turn in the silence. Nora pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound only grew clearer, bypassing her body entirely. She heard her name spoken distinctly now. stretched into a sigh that curled like smoke. Noura. She stumbled to the kitchen, determined to shut the blinds, to bolt the door. But as she reached for the latch, she froze. The orchard was visible again, not in daylight clarity, not even in moonlight, but in a faint, internal glow, as though each tree contained a smoldering ember. Their shapes were outlined in dull fire, trunks and branches shimmering softly against the black sky. At the center stood the leaning tree. Its glow was brighter than the rest, its limbs stretched impossibly wide, and she saw with gut certainty that the ropes of the swing hung taut though no wind stirred. The seat moved in steady rhythm, back and forth, as though someone invisible sat there, legs too long, swaying with patient ease. Her pulse quickened. She shut the blinds, retreated down the hall, but the voices seeped through every surface, rising and falling in a cadence that matched the rhythm of the swing. She lay in bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, each creak of the rope echoing in her skull. And sometime past midnight, though she could not say when, she heard the sound of the porch steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing them, one slow footfall after another, until the boards just outside her door creaked with waiting. The creaking of the porch steps did not stop. It did not continue either. It lingered, one board bent beneath invisible weight, refusing to release. Noura lay rigid in her bed, her pulse thudding in her ears so loudly it nearly drowned out the silence. She told herself it was a dream, that her body had sunk into a half-sleep where sounds carried from the orchard into her mind, but her throat was dry and aching, and her palms were slick with sweat. Dreams, she thought, should not feel this sharp. Minutes stretched into something longer, something without measure. The lamp by her bedside flickered faintly, though it was not switched on, as if the air itself had chosen to glow for a moment before dying back to dark. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, heavier than they should be, their edges soft like cloth soaked in water. Noura turned her head slowly toward the window. The blinds were shut, but through the thin slats a faint red shimmer seeped, pulsing with the rhythm of the swing outside. She could almost imagine she was staring into the orchard's heartbeat, its glow leaking into the house with every sway of the rope. The answering machine clicked again, soft but deliberate, and this time a low static filled the room. Beneath the static she heard breathing, long and steady, in and out, until her own lungs fell into rhythm with it. She pressed her face into the pillow, trying to block the sound, but the breath was inside her chest now, too deep to expel. And then came a voice, close as if whispered against her ear. "Come out." She sat upright, heart hammering, convinced someone stood at her bedside. The room was empty. Only the faint red shimmer remained, spilling through the blinds in slow, measured waves. When she glanced at the clock, the hands had frozen at midnight. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. It's still midnight. She closed them for what felt like a second, opened them, and the clock remained unchanged. The night had stopped moving, holding her in a loop of waiting, a breath suspended without end. The creak of the porch step deepened, wood groaning as though more weight had joined the first. Another footfall, slow, patient, deliberate, then another. The boards outside her door sank lower under the invisible pressure, until it seemed inevitable that the door would open not with a knock, but with the steady push of something that had been waiting too long to be invited. And all the while, beneath every sound, the orchard whispered, not loud, not demanding, only persistent, a low chant that seemed to swell from the soil itself. With us, with us, with us. The door never opened with a bang. It sighed. The latch clicked as though nudged from within, and the wood eased inward, slow and unwilling, as if the house itself resisted the intrusion. Noura pressed her back against the headboard, her breath shallow, the quilt bunched in her fists. The air thickened. The red shimmer that had bled through the blinds now poured directly into the room, stretching across the floor in veins of dull light. It crawled up the walls, pooled across the ceiling, until the space felt submerged in a glow that pulsed like blood through a vein. With every throb of that light, she thought she heard the orchard breathe, and then came the sound of the swing. Not outside now, but here, its steady rhythm reverberating through the boards beneath her bed, a back-and-forth creak that set her teeth on edge. She pressed her hands against her ears, but it was inside her bones, a weight shifting one way, then the other, dragging her heart into its pendulum beat. The answering machine clicked sharply. A voice emerged from its static. And this time it was her grandmother's, clear, familiar, tender. "Child, don't be afraid. It's only the orchard." "El." Nora's chest clenched. For one fragile instant, the words soothed her, a thread tying her back to years when the orchard was nothing but laughter and summer fruit. But as the voice repeated, it faltered, split, multiplied. Dozens of voices now layered over each other, all whispering the same line. "Don't be afraid. It's only the orchard. It's only the orchard," until the phrase collapses into meaningless sound, a chant swelling and dissolving into pure noise. The door widened. Cold air slipped in, carrying with it the scent of apples so strong it made her gag. Shadows lengthened across the threshold, not entering but stretching, touching, questing. They pooled together, forming a shape that was not a person but resembled one enough to make her skin crawl, an outline of a figure bent forward, its head tilted, its arms hanging too long, as though the orchard had tried to sculpt a body out of branches and failed. The swing's rhythm grew heavier, dragging the house into its motion. She clutched the quilt tighter, but the red glow pulsed stronger, pressing into her eyes until it filled her vision. When she blinked, she no longer saw the room. She stood once more among the trees, barefoot on cold soil, the orchard lit from within, as though its roots carried fire. The leaning tree loomed ahead, its ropes stretched taut, the swing moving with unnatural precision, and this time there was no mistaking the figure seated there. It was not child nor adult, not man nor woman, but something caught between forms, a blur of limbs, a face hidden by a spill of hair. Its weight bowed the plank deeply, yet it swayed with impossible grace, each arc pulling the orchard's breath with it. The whispers thundered, no longer voices but a chorus of need. She felt them pressing against her skull, her chest, her blood, urging her forward. The roots writhed in the soil, knotting across her path, and she realized the orchard did not want her to walk, it wanted her to kneel. Her knees buckled before she could resist. The earth was damp, clinging, rising almost liquid around her shins. The swing slowed, the figure lifting its head at last. She could not see its face clearly, only the hollow where features should be, shifting like a mouth that had never decided on a shape. The voice came not from the machine, not from the trees, but from everywhere at once. "With us." And the orchard leaned closer, every trunk bending, every branch reaching, the entire grove collapsing inward, as though the world itself would fold and swallow her whole. The orchard did not close all at once. It folded slowly, like fabric drawn together by invisible hands, each tree bending in sequence until their branches arched overhead, weaving into a ceiling of wood and shadow. Nora knelt in the damp soil, her breath ragged, the ground beneath her shivering as if alive. She tried to rise, but her body moved as though underwater, every motion delayed, each gesture sluggish and blurred. The swing creaked in steady rhythm, and with each arc the orchard seemed to tilt with it, the world swaying like a ship caught on dark waves. The figure upon the swing had no fixed edges, its form blurred, stretching thin, then collapsing inward, like smoke caught in a jar. Each time it swung forward, it drew nearer, though the ropes never shortened. Each time it swung back, it grew taller, its head brushing the canopy woven above. The whispers pressed harder, no longer a chorus, but a low droning hum, the sound of countless mouths forming words she could almost understand but not quite. They echoed inside her skull, filling the hollow of her thoughts until her own inner voice was drowned out. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a whisper escaped, seamlessly joining the others. She pressed her hands over her ears. It did not matter. The sound lived inside her. When she shut her eyes, the orchard appeared sharper, brighter, its trees glowing red from within as though her eyelids were glass. When she opened them, the world blurred, dreamlike, faces forming in the knots of bark only to vanish as she tried to focus. The earth beneath her shifted, roots pushed upward through the soil, twining around her ankles and calves, cool and damp, their texture strangely soft, like fingers pressing gently against her skin. They were not violent. They were insistent. They wanted her still, not gone. And then she heard the swing pause mid-arc. No creak, no sway, just silence. When she looked again, the figure had stepped off. She could not tell where it had gone. One moment it was there, head bowed, hair veiling its face. The next it was part of the orchard, dissolved into the trees, though she felt it moving nearer, as if walking without steps, as if the space between them was shrinking on its own. Time buckled. She glanced up and found the sky fractured. Not black, but divided into thin slices of color, slivers of dawn, of dusk, of midnight, stacked atop each other, all layered and trembling. The orchard existed in every hour at once, and she in the center of it, pinned like an insect beneath glass. Her grandmother's voice returned, softer now, whispering right against her ear. "It's only the orchard. Only the orchard. Only the orchard." But as Nora turned, expecting empty air, she saw the outline of a handprint forming on her shoulder, fingers sinking through fabric and skin, with the gentleness of someone guiding her to kneel deeper into the earth. The orchard leaned closer, patient, waiting. When Nora opened her eyes again, it was morning, not fractured dawn, not the glowing red twilight of the orchard's breath, but simple, ordinary daylight spilling across the quilt. For a long moment she did not move, afraid that if she shifted even slightly, the vision would collapse back into the other place, the place of roots and whispers. The house was still. The clock ticked again, its hands unstuck, moving forward with quiet certainty. No glow seeped beneath the blinds. No voice whispered in her ear. She sat up, her body heavy, her knees sore as if she had spent the night kneeling. When she pulled back the quilt, she saw dirt clinging to her shins, fine dark soil pressed into the fabric of her skin, as though she had slept with her legs buried. Nora stumbled to the bathroom, scrubbed her hands and arms raw, but the faint black stain around her wrist would not lift, the same place where she had once touched the rope of the swing. She wrapped a bandage around it, hiding it from sight, though the pressure of the cloth only deepened the ache beneath. The orchard through the window looked harmless, rows neat, branches heavy with red fruit shining under the sun. The leaning tree stood where it always had, no nearer, no stranger than before. She tried to believe it, tried to convince herself it had all been dream layered upon dream. And yet, as she turned from the window, she heard it, the faint creak of a swing swaying back and forth, its rhythm perfectly steady. She froze, her breath held, the sound threading softly through the quiet house. When she dared to look again, the orchard was still. No swing moved, no figure waited beneath the tree, only silence. But that night, as she lay in bed, just on the edge of sleep, she felt the mattress dip, as though someone had perched gently on its edge. A warmth pressed against her shoulder, light as a breath. And from far out in the orchard, or perhaps from the very room itself, came a murmur, patient and unyielding, words folding into her dreams. "With us." And she understood then that she had never left the orchard at all. Long after the daylight had folded across the orchard, and the house had quieted into its shallow rest, a hush remained, a hush too heavy, too deliberate, to be called silence. It was the kind of stillness that lingered behind closed eyes, following breath into the fragile space between waking and dream. The orchard was there too, waiting. Its trees did not move, but their shadows stretched across the walls of the mind, roots threading gently beneath thought, branches bending softly overhead. For some, the whispers came faintly, like a lullaby misremembered. For others, it was only the rhythm of the swing, back and forth, a pendulum rocking them toward uneasy sleep. And in that fragile moment, just before the body surrenders to dreams, a single word surfaced, quiet, patient, almost kind. "With us." The orchard exhaled, and the night drifted on. Story 4. The house at the edge of sleep. The road narrowed as Elias drove deeper into the hills, its edges crumbling into ditches where rainwater pooled in dark mirrors. His headlights caught the drifting fog, each beam carving tunnels through the pale gray, and for long stretches he could almost believe he was moving nowhere at all, suspended in a corridor made of mist and shadow. The engine hummed steadily beneath him, yet time itself seemed to blur, minutes sliding into hours without measure. He told himself he was only tired, a long day of travel, a stretch of country roads too empty to offer distraction. But the silence around him pressed heavy, the kind of quiet that deepened with every mile, as though sound itself had thinned, leaving only the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. When he finally saw the house, it appeared suddenly, no gradual approach, no silhouette forming against the horizon. One moment there was nothing but fog and trees. The next, headlights swept across the faded siding of a two-story farmhouse perched just off the road, its windows dark, its roofline bent slightly with age. Elias slowed, heart lurching. He checked the map again, though the screen had gone blank minutes before, frozen at a point with no marked roads. The farmhouse wasn't listed. Still, something in him insisted this was where the journey had been leading, as if each curve of the road had conspired to deliver him to this exact place. He parked by the gate, the gravel crunching loudly in the stillness. The air outside was damp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, though no chimney stirred. His breath clouded as he stood, staring at the house. The windows reflected nothing, not even the headlights behind him, as though they were panes of obsidian set into the walls. Elias told himself he would just look, just stretch his legs before continuing. But his steps drew him closer, the gate swinging open without resistance, the path leading straight to the porch. Each board groaned beneath his weight, not in protest but in recognition, as though the house had been waiting to feel footsteps again. At the threshold, he hesitated. The door was closed, the paint peeling in strips, yet the faintest glow seeped from the edges, warm and inviting, like candlelight hidden within. He could almost hear it, a murmur beneath the silence, the suggestion of voices speaking low, as though someone inside were already aware of him, already making space for him to enter, and though every part of him whispered to turn back, to walk into the fog and find another road, his hand lifted of its own accord, pressing gently against the door. It opened without a sound. The fog did not lift as Elias approached. It thickened, folding in quiet layers around the car, until even the trees were no longer trees but pale vertical smudges, like charcoal lines half erased on a canvas. The world narrowed to sound, the steady thrum of the engine, the faint hiss of tires on wet gravel, the rhythmic pulse of his own breathing. It was less a drive than a drift, as though he were being ferried along a corridor built only for him. Once or twice he thought he glimpsed shapes in the mist angles where none should be, the outline of rooftops that dissolved when he blinked, silhouettes standing between the trunks with faces turned away. Each time he slowed, searching, but the road only stretched ahead, vacant and featureless. His headlights found no markers, no signs, not even the reflective gleam of paint. It was as though the road existed solely beneath his wheels, called into being with each passing moment, vanishing the instant he left it behind. Fatigue dragged at him, heavy as lead. He rubbed at his eyes, certain he would wake any second to discover he had dozed at the wheel. But the world remained consistent, its strangeness unbroken. Somewhere within him, a whisper began to grow faint, patient, without words, not warning, not welcome, simply presence. And then the fog shifted, not parted, not lifted, but rippled, as if stirred from within. Through it, the farmhouse emerged, not revealed but delivered, like a card pulled from a deck, already chosen before he arrived. He slowed to a crawl. The house leaned against the fog as though it had been resting there all along, its outlines soft, edges blurred, the kind of place one might remember from childhood dreams but never from waking memory. Its windows were dark, but not blind. He felt watched, as if the glass held eyes that had only just closed, feigning sleep. The path leading to it seemed inevitable, carved by the fog itself, each step predetermined. Even before he killed the engine, he knew he would not leave. He could not say why. The farmhouse held nothing outwardly remarkable, weathered siding, a roofline softened by time, yet it radiated an inevitability that pressed against him like gravity. He opened the car door and the fog slipped in, cool and damp, wrapping around his shoulders like a garment he could not shrug off. The air smelled faintly of apples and wood smoke, though no orchard grew nearby and no chimney smoked above. He felt suddenly certain he had smelled this before, not here but years ago, in a dream he could no longer recall. When he reached the gate, his hand rested on the latch without thought. It swung open easily, as though the rust had been kept away for this single gesture. The boards beneath his shoes accepted his weight, groaning not in protest but in welcome. And by the time he stood at the porch, staring at the glow slipping through the cracks of the closed door, Elias realized he could not remember the moment he had chosen to stop the car, or the moment he had left the driver's seat, or even the moment his feet began carrying him forward. It was as if he had always been walking toward this threshold, each breath of his life leading to this single place. The door waited. The door yielded beneath his hand as though it had been waiting, the hinges offering no protest, no sound, only the sensation of a barrier ceasing to exist. Elias stepped across the threshold and was enveloped by a warmth that did not belong to electricity or fire. It was the warmth of a place long inhabited, a breath still lingering in the air after the speaker has gone silent. Inside, the house glowed faintly, not from lamps or bulbs, but from a diffuse illumination that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, a light without source, pale and steady as moonlight filtered through gauze. The air carried a scent both sharp and sweet, apples gone soft, wood polished by generations of hands, linen that had waited too long in a trunk. The first room was larger than the exterior suggested. A parlor, perhaps, though stripped of the usual markers. No furniture, no pictures, no clutter. Only the outlines remained, shadows of chairs pressed into the floorboards, rectangles of lighter paint where frames had once hung, the faint indentations of a rug long removed. It was less a room than the memory of one, as though he were standing inside the echo of a life once lived. His footsteps fell too heavily. Each creak lingered long after he lifted his foot, reverberating down the hall as if the sound were reluctant to leave. He told himself it was only acoustics, only age, but the boards beneath his shoes felt pliant, yielding slightly, as though remembering the weight of others who had walked this path before. At the far end of the room, a staircase rose, narrow and steep, vanishing into shadow. The banister gleamed faintly, polished smooth, though when his hand brushed it he felt not wood but something softer, like skin warmed by a pulse beneath. He snatched his hand back, heart quickening, yet when he touched it again, it was nothing more than oak, solid and cool. He turned from the stairs and wandered deeper. Each door he passed opened soundlessly at the brush of his fingertips, revealing rooms both empty and not. A kitchen stripped bare of utensils, yet the smell of bread hung heavy in the air. A study without books, yet the faint rustle of pages turning drifted from the corners. A bedroom where no bed stood, only a darker patch of floor, yet the air above it sagged, warm as though someone had just risen. Everywhere he went, absence and presence tangled until he no longer knew whether he was intruding on a place abandoned or welcomed into a place that had never ceased to be lived in. At last he stopped in a small sitting room. A single object remained here, a chair set before the window, its fabric pale with age, the wood carved with delicate spirals worn smooth by time. Elias approached cautiously. The chair faced outward, toward the fog pressing against the glass. For an instant he thought he saw a figure seated there, blurred by the dim light, shoulders bowed, head inclined. But when he blinked, the chair was empty. Still, the cushion bore the faint indentation of weight, and the air around it was warm. He stood very still, listening. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard shifted, not the quick pop of timber expanding, but the long, slow sigh of wood bending beneath a step. Another followed, then another. The rhythm was patient, deliberate, and it was descending the staircase he had left behind. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He waited, pulse drumming, every muscle taut. Yet no figure appeared. The steps ceased, leaving only the hush of the fog pressing at the windows, the silent glow of the house watching him in return. And in that silence he realized something unsettling. He could not remember closing the door behind him. Elias moved slowly through the house, though each step felt less like a choice and more like a continuation of some dream he had entered long before he arrived. The rooms unfolded with a strange rhythm, one leading into the next without logic, as if the house arranged itself moment by moment around him. He entered what must once have been a dining room. The table was gone, but its outline remained, lighter wood in the shape of an absence, and above it a chandelier swayed ever so slightly, though no breeze moved the air. Its crystals caught the dim glow, scattering fragments of light across the walls in shifting patterns. For a moment the shapes resembled faces, mouths half open, eyes searching, before sliding apart into meaningless geometry. The wallpaper peeled in long vertical strips, curling toward him, and in the exposed plaster beneath he saw faint imprints, as though hands had pressed from the other side. He leaned closer, but the shadows shifted, and the wall was only wall again. He crossed into a corridor so narrow it felt less built than grown, the ceiling sloping down, the floorboards bending gently beneath his steps as though the house inhaled and exhaled around him. At one end a door stood ajar. Inside, a room no larger than a closet exhaled the scent of lavender, thick and cloying, the unmistakable perfume of sheets kept too long in cedar. No furniture, No linens, only the smell, so vivid that Elias could almost feel the fabric brushing his fingertips. Each room left him with the impression of something just departed. A child's bedroom with no bed, yet the faint scrape of a lullaby box winding down. A pantry with empty shelves, yet the taste of salt sharp on his tongue. A parlor stripped of curtains, yet dust motes swirled as though someone had just drawn them back to let in morning light. He began to lose track of doors, of hallways, of direction itself. Rooms blurred into one another. Staircases appeared where none should be. And sometimes when he turned, he found himself back at a place he could have sworn he had left behind, yet the details had shifted. A picture frame now hung empty on the wall where before there had been none. A chair bore a deep impression as though someone had only just risen. It was as though the house did not want him to leave. Not yet, but instead wanted him to wander, to learn its memory by degrees. And always, beneath it all, the faint sound of steps descending the staircase, never closer, never gone. By the time Elias found himself once more at the sitting room with the single chair, he could not remember how many doors he had passed through, nor how many turns he had taken. His breath was shallow, his pulse steady but faster than it should have been, and the sense pressed down upon him that he was no longer exploring the house. The house was exploring him. It was only when Elias glanced at the window again that he realized night had come. There had been no sunset, no soft dimming of light. No transition at all, only the sudden certainty that outside the glass, the fog had deepened into blackness, thick and impenetrable, pressing against the panes like water against a diver's mask. The house was cut off, floating in its own pocket of time. The glow that had once seeped from the walls grew fainter, its pale warmth retreating into corners, leaving shadows long and heavy across the floor. They did not behave as shadows should. They did not cling to the contours of objects, but stretched toward him, reaching thinly across the boards, bending in ways that did not follow the angle of the light. He stood very still in the sitting room, every instinct telling him to leave. Yet when he tried to recall the front door, he could not picture its location. He had passed through so many halls, so many rooms. The memory of entrance had dissolved. The silence pressed close, broken only by the slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard above him. Elias's head lifted sharply, breath caught in his chest. Another creak followed, then another, a measured pace moving across the upstairs hall. Each groan of timber carried weight, a presence not hurried, not hesitant, but assured, as though whoever walked there had every right to be. He told himself it was the house settling, old wood shifting with the night air. Yet the steps continued, too steady, too precise. A pause. Then the soft scrape of something dragged gently across the floor, a sound that suggested furniture or a body. The glow in the room dimmed further, shadows gathering like water around his feet. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the corner, the outline of a figure bent forward, head inclined, watching. But when he turned, there was only the empty chair by the window, its cushion still bearing the impression of unseen weight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He forced himself toward the door, determined to find the stairs, to prove to himself that nothing waited above. The hallway beyond seemed narrower now, walls leaning inward, the ceiling lower than before. The boards groaned beneath his steps, echoing down into the unseen spaces below, as though the whole house were hollow and listening. At the base of the staircase he hesitated. The banister gleamed faintly, though no light fell upon it. Shadows pooled at the top of the stairs, thick and opaque. Yet within them he thought he glimpsed the faintest shimmer of movement, like cloth stirred by an unseen hand. The air grew colder as he placed his hand on the railing. For a heartbeat it was only wood beneath his palm. Then, faintly, it pulsed. From above came a sound so quiet he almost doubted it. The slow, rhythmic breath of someone waiting. The first step groaned as Elias placed his weight upon it, the sound unnaturally prolonged, as if the wood resisted, reluctant to let him ascend. He hesitated, hand still on the railing, pulse trembling against the faint throb that seemed to beat within the banister itself. Yet the silence above did not break. The breathing he thought he heard had faded, leaving only the dense hush pressing down the stairwell. He climbed, slowly, carefully, each step a negotiation between will and dread. The shadows thickened the higher he rose, swallowing the faint glow that lingered on the lower floor. By the time he reached the landing, it felt as though he had passed out of the house and into another realm, one where walls and ceilings no longer obeyed the rules of structure, but curved and folded like the insides of a dream. The hallway stretched before him, long and dim, lined with doors on either side. None were shut entirely. Each stood open by a fraction, thin slivers of darkness spilling out, hinting at rooms that breathed their own air. Elias paused, listening. The floor beneath him creaked softly, but he did not move. The house moved instead. From one of the doors ahead came the faint sound of something brushing fabric slow, deliberate, like a hand smoothing a sheet. He advanced, drawn against his own better judgment. Each door seemed to lean closer as he passed, as though straining to open wider, inviting him inward. At one threshold he glimpsed a room entirely empty but for a rocking chair swaying gently, though no hand touched it. At another, a mirror leaned against the wall, its glass clouded, reflecting not his form but the vague outline of someone taller, thinner, standing where he stood. The hallway narrowed, the air cooler now, tinged with the faint metallic tang of iron. His breath fogged faintly before him, though no window was open. And then he saw it. At the far end of the hall, a door wider than the rest, yawning open into a darkness too deep, too complete. From within that void came the slow, steady rhythm of the breathing he had heard before. It was not hidden now. It filled the hall, measured and patient, as though the thing in that room had been waiting for him, matching its pace to his own heartbeat. Elias forced himself forward, though his legs trembled. The floor dipped subtly beneath his steps, like the boards bowed under an invisible weight, flexing not only for him but for something unseen that walked in tandem. When he reached the doorframe, he halted. The room beyond was vast, impossibly so, larger than the house should allow. Its ceiling arched high above, beams lost in shadow, its corners dissolving into gloom, and in the center of the floor lay a bed. The frame was ornate, carved wood twisting into shapes that seemed almost to move in the dim light. Branches, vines, faces, half-formed. The sheets were drawn back, and the indentation of a body stretched across the mattress. Though the bed was empty, the breathing came louder here, not from the bed, not from the corners, but from the very air itself. Each inhale swelled the walls. Each exhale pressed them inward again, as if the entire room were a lung, alive and aware. Elias's gaze caught on the far wall, where a window should have been. Instead, there was only a mirror, tall and narrow, its glass dark and rippling as though filled with water. He stepped closer, compelled. His reflection emerged slowly from the black surface, but it was wrong. The figure staring back did not stand still, but swayed gently, as though seated in a rocking chair. Its mouth moved, shaping words Elias could not hear. The breath of the house deepened. The doors behind him sighed shut, one by one, until only silence remained. And then, from the mirror, his reflection smiled. For a long while, Elias could not move. He stood in the doorway of the impossible room, his eyes fixed upon the mirror where his reflection swayed gently, rocking as if cradled by some unseen rhythm. The smile on its face did not change, did not widen or fade. It remained a steady curve, as patient as the tide, as inevitable as breath. The sound of breathing filled the chamber, slow and tidal, each inhalation drawing the air thinner, each exhalation pressing weight upon his chest. He tried to measure his own breath against it, but soon he could not tell which belonged to him and which belonged to the house. His lungs filled when it filled, emptied when it emptied, until he felt himself only an echo of its rhythm. The bed beckoned to him. Its sheets, though empty, bore the shape of a body, and in the dim glow the indentation seemed to deepen, as though someone invisible shifted, making space for him. The wood of the frame curled and writhed in the corners of his vision, branches weaving tighter, faces bending to watch. He turned away, but the sensation of being observed did not lessen. It multiplied, as though every grain of timber in the room had grown eyes. He closed his eyes, but this was worse. Behind his lids he saw corridors unspooling without end, rooms folding into one another, chairs rocking, doors yawning wider, all suffused with that dim glow that was not light but memory. He saw himself walking through them endlessly, his reflection always a step ahead, always turning to watch, always smiling. A low hum threaded through the breathing, not quite words but close enough that meaning trembled just out of reach. It rose from the walls, the floor, the bed, and the glass of the mirror, vibrating in his bones until he thought he might dissolve into sound. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the noise only deepened. a resonance that lived within rather than without. The mirror rippled. His reflection tilted its head, eyes bright though the glass remained dark. For the first time it moved differently from him, raising one hand slowly, beckoning. The gesture was deliberate, almost tender, yet it carried with it the inevitability of gravity. Elias felt his own arm twitch in response, a phantom pull urging him closer. The floor beneath his feet shifted, subtle but undeniable. The boards no longer held him firmly. They had softened, yielding like the surface of water. Each step forward sank slightly, not enough to trap him, but enough to suggest that the house itself had begun to absorb him, to fold him into its breathing rhythm. The bed sighed, its sheets rustling though no hand touched them. The indentation widened, deepened, as though it had been waiting not for one body but for two. And still, from the mirror, the reflection smiled. Elias's body moved before his mind agreed, drawn forward by the steady pull of the mirror. Each step was muffled, as though his feet pressed not upon wood but upon something pliant, like fabric stretched over hollow space. The closer he came, the more the air thickened, each breath dragging through him like smoke, heavy and intimate. The mirror rippled again, a skin of black water trembling under some unseen wind. His reflection had grown sharper now, no longer a blurred twin but a figure with uncanny clarity. Its eyes were his, but deeper, sunken wells that shimmered with faint light, as though lit from within. The reflection no longer mirrored his hesitation. It leaned forward, hands still raised, palm outward in invitation or command. Behind him, the bed sighed. The sheets pulled tight, then loosened again, a steady rhythm, as though lungs expanded and collapsed beneath the linen. The indentation deepened, spreading toward the edge, a silent urging for him to lie down, to take the place prepared. The carved wood of the frame writhed almost imperceptibly, vines coiling tighter, faces stretching mouths in soundless murmurs. Elias's chest hammered. He tried to turn back, but the air resisted, thickened, his body sluggish as though submerged. Every direction but forward seemed sealed. The mirror pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat, and for a moment he was certain it was not a reflection at all, but a doorway and opening into some other chamber of the house, where a version of himself had been waiting all along. A word surfaced then, born on the hum that had threaded through the walls since he arrived. Not loud, not shouted, but breathed into him, intimate as a whisper against his ear. "Lie down." His knees weakened. He staggered toward the bed, hands brushing the sheets. They were warm, impossibly warm, as if someone had just risen. The fabric clung to his skin, damp with the sweat of another body. His pulse faltered, breath catching, yet the warmth spread upward through his arms, his chest lulling, insistent. From the mirror, his reflection tilted its head, smile widening now, revealing teeth too sharp, too many, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Its lips moved again, forming the words he had already heard, though no sound reached his ears this time. Still, he felt them, vibrating inside his skull. "Lie down." The room bent around him, walls swelling and shrinking with each collective breath, the entire house inhaling, exhaling, waiting for him to surrender. He felt the boards beneath his feet grow soft, then fluid, rising to his ankles as though he stood in warm water. His reflection reached closer, its hand breaking the surface of the mirror, droplets falling without sound to the floor. The bed groaned. The space beside the hollow in the mattress sank deeper, deeper, until it formed a perfect shape beside the waiting absence, two places, side by side. Elias stumbled once more, caught between the pull of the mirror and the beckoning bed. His breath was no longer his own. The rhythm belonged to the house, and he could no longer resist its cadence. The reflection extended its hand fully now, waiting. The bed sighed louder, the wood twisting, vines opening their carved mouths in voiceless hunger. And Elias knew, with the clarity of a man standing at the edge of a dream, that whether he chose the bed or the mirror, it would make no difference. The house would take him. When Elias opened his eyes, he was no longer standing in the upstairs room. He was lying across the back seat of his car, the engine silent, the fog pressed thick against the windows. His head throbbed as though from fever or dream, his mouth dry with the taste of dust. For a long moment he could not recall how he had returned here, only that the memory of the house clung to him like damp clothes, heavy, impossible to peel away. He sat up slowly, disoriented. The key was still in the ignition. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, yet the digits meant nothing to him. They shifted when he tried to focus, rearranging themselves into symbols he almost recognized. Outside, the fog swirled as it had before, veiling the road, and beyond it he thought he saw the faint outline of the farmhouse. But when he blinked, it was gone. His body ached as though he had walked for hours. His palms still carried the faint warmth of sheets, and when he raised them to his face, he swore he smelled linen aged, sweet with dust, cloying with the scent of lavender. He wiped his eyes, but the smell lingered, clinging to his skin. A laugh echoed faintly inside his skull, though his ears registered nothing. It was soft, private, no louder than his own breath. For a heartbeat, he thought it belonged to him, but the tone was wrong. Too measured, too patient. He looked into the rearview mirror. His reflection stared back, pale and shaken, but when he leaned forward to study it more closely, he saw the faintest twitch of a smile curve across its mouth, a fraction too late to be his own. Elias tore his gaze away, twisting the key, desperate for the hum of the engine. It started at once, the vibration soothing in its normalcy. The headlights pierced the fog, illuminating the empty road. With trembling hands, he steered forward, convinced that if he could only keep moving, the house would dissolve behind him, nothing more than a figment of exhaustion. Yet as the car rolled on, the mist thickened. The road stretched endlessly, without turn, without sign, and somewhere behind the glass he swore he heard the slow, tidal rhythm of breathing. It matched his own. Story 5. The Wrench in the Dark. The first rule my mom gave me was to lock all the doors. I wish I had listened. Being home alone at 7 years old should have been terrifying, especially with a storm of biblical proportions trying to tear the sky open outside. Thunder rattled the house on its foundations, and the rain came down in sheets, blurring the world outside my windows into a watery gray mess. But I wasn't scared. I was thrilled. It was an adventure. My parents, caught on the other side of the city by the flash storm, had called with 100 apologies, their voices crackling over the landline. I, of course, played it cool. "I'm fine, Mom. Don't worry. Love you." The moment I hung up, I was king. The entire house was my kingdom. The remote control was my scepter. A fortress of couch cushions became my throne. My royal decree? Unlimited candy, and absolutely no bedtime. I was deep into a cartoon marathon, fueled by a sugar rush that felt like it could power a small rocket. When my eyelids started to feel like they had lead weights attached to them, I remember thinking I should probably get up and do the checklist Mom had given me. Lock the doors, close the blinds, leave a light on. Later, I told myself, I'll do it right before I go to my real bed. I was planning on staying up all night, obviously. I never made it. The sugar crash came for me, swift and merciless. One moment I was watching a coyote chase a roadrunner. The next, I was gone. I woke up, not to a sound, but to a feeling. Cold. A deep, biting, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the storm. It was the kind of chill that seeps right into your bones. The kind that feels like it's emanating from inside the house, not outside. The television screen was black, its little red standby light blinking patiently. It must have been hours. Shivering, I peeled myself off the sticky leather of the couch. The first coherent thought to pierce my sleepy brain was my mom's voice. "Did you lock the doors, Leo?" Ugh. I knew she'd somehow know if I didn't. Moms just know. So I forced my stiff legs to move and started the security tour. Front door. The deadbolt was already thrown. Weird. I didn't remember doing that. Maybe Dad did it before they left. I checked the knob. Locked tight. Then the back door off the kitchen. Same thing. The chain was on. The deadbolt was shot. I went around to every single window on the first floor, my small hands pushing against the glass. All sealed, all locked. That didn't make sense. If everything was shut tight, why did it feel like a freezer? The house was still bleeding that impossible cold. I stood in the middle of the living room, hugging myself, my breath misting slightly in the air. A logical explanation tried to form in my kid brain. Maybe the storm knocked out the heater? Yeah, that had to be it. It made sense, and I was so tired. I desperately wanted it to make sense. I couldn't waste any more energy on it. Bed was calling. I trudged up the stairs, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. My bedroom was at the front of the house, and here, the storm was a living entity. The rain wasn't just falling. It was slamming against the glass, angry and wanting in. Every few minutes, a blast of lightning would bleach the world white, followed a second later by a deafening crack of thunder that vibrated in my chest. I wasn't usually scared of storms, but this one felt different, meaner. I crawled under my covers, pulling my blanket up to my chin. I just wanted to sleep, to forget the cold downstairs and the angry storm outside. But as I lay there listening, I started to pick up on another sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the roar of the storm. A creak. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't a tree branch scraping the roof. It sounded like shifting wood, slow and deliberate. But my entire upstairs was carpeted, the thick, plush kind that swallows sound. There was nothing to creak. Where was it coming from? It started to bother me. A lot. It was a stupid little sound, but it wormed its way into my head. And suddenly, the storm wasn't what was keeping me awake. It was creaking. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat bolt upright in bed, my eyes scanning the dark corners of my room, not even sure what I was looking for. I held my breath, trying to isolate the sound. Creak. It was closer this time, in the room with me. Just then, lightning flashed, turning my room into a stark black and white photograph for a single horrifying second. My eyes darted around. Desk, chair, dresser, everything looked normal, but my gaze snagged on the only other piece of wooden furniture. The closet door. It was shut. The room plunged back into darkness. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I sat there, perfectly still, a statue carved from fear, waiting. For what? I didn't know. It felt like an hour, but it was probably only a minute before the next flash of lightning lit up the sky. And in that split second of brilliant white light, I saw it. I swear I felt my heart stop. The closet door was open. Just a crack. A sliver of pure, impenetrable blackness that hadn't been there a minute ago. I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't heard anything but the storm and that one single creak. But it was open. I knew, with a certainty that was absolute and soul-crushing, that I had closed it that morning. I always did. Something had opened it. There was an intruder in my room. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. My brain just shut off. All that was left was a primal, animal instinct. Get out. Moving with a slowness I didn't know I possessed. I swung my legs out of bed. The floor felt miles away. I pushed myself up, as quietly as I could, and started walking toward my bedroom door. Every single step was a lifetime. The walk from my bed to the hallway felt like a 500-mile journey across a desert of fear, with a predator watching my every move. I made it out, pulling my door shut without making a sound. I didn't run. I crept downstairs and immediately dove under the heavy oak dining room table, pulling one of the tall back chairs in front of the opening like a shield. And then, and only then, did the dam break. I started crying. Silent, hot tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what else to do. My parents were too far away. There was someone in my house, in my room. I'm not sure how long I cowered there, curled into a tight ball. But at some point, I heard it. Footsteps, coming down the stairs. I clapped my hands over my mouth, stifling a sob. Any sound I made could end my life. They weren't normal footsteps. It wasn't the steady tread of a person walking. It sounded chaotic. Like whatever it was jumping and pinballing down the stairs, stumbling with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. The footsteps got closer. They were approaching the dining room table. It sounded like they knew exactly where I was hiding. I really thought I was going to die. And then, from under the table, I saw them. I couldn't see my upper body, just two bare feet that walked into my view, and they were the most disgusting things I have ever seen. They were caked in wet black mud, with long yellowed toenails. The muddy legs were slick and streaked with filth, covered in dozens of angry red cuts, as if their owner had been rolling around in a thorn bush. But the worst part was the color of the skin underneath the grime, a sickly, jaundiced yellow. They were so grotesque, so misshapen. I couldn't tell if they belonged to a man or a woman. They stumbled to a stop right beside the table. And then, just as I thought it couldn't get any worse, it dropped something. It was a wrench, a big, heavy, metal one. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening clang that echoed in the charged silence of the house. I'm telling you, It took every fiber of my being to fight back a scream. If it bends down to pick up the wrench, it'll see me. That was the only thought in my head. It'll see me, and I'm dead. With wide, tear-filled eyes, I watched as the thing stood perfectly still. It didn't pick up the wrench, but it didn't walk away either. It just stood there, its nasty yellow legs motionless beside my hiding spot. It felt like a standoff where any wrong move, any tiny sound, could be my last. Eventually, after an eternity of silence, the chaotic footsteps finally continued. They stumbled around the first floor for what felt like hours, a tour of my home conducted by a monster. And then I heard it, the sound I had been praying for. The front door opened, and then shut. It was gone. I stayed hidden under that table for a long, long time after that. Part of it was fear, but another part was something else. Something I can only describe now as trauma. I just remember being shaken, a deep, trembling shudder I couldn't control. I was at that ripe age where I understood exactly how dangerous the situation was, but not old enough to have any idea how to deal with it. The rest of the night is a blur. I eventually crawled out. The first thing I did was pick up the wrench off the floor. It felt wrong in my small hands. Heavy, cold, an artifact from a nightmare. I knew I should tell my parents, but a deeper, colder fear told me to hide it. A fear of getting in trouble for not locking the doors. Sure, but also a fear of having to explain something I couldn't understand. A fear that they wouldn't believe me. So I took it upstairs and tucked it away in the darkest corner of my closet. The same closet where the nightmare began. I thought the silence that followed was safe, but I was wrong. For another boy, miles away and years later, the silence was just the brief moment before the screaming started. Story 6. The Howl in the Park. For Sam, the rain wasn't a threat, it was an escape. At least that's what he thought until he saw the shape lying in the middle of the road. My name is Sam, and for as long as I can remember, sleep has been my enemy. I have a particularly frustrating brand of insomnia, the kind where my brain decides to host a rock concert the second my head hits the pillow. And rain. Most people find the sound of rain soothing. For me, it's like listening to a million tiny drums, each one beating slightly out of time. It's a relentless, chaotic percussion that makes sleep completely impossible. This particular night was no different. It was well after midnight, and the steady drumming on the roof was a mocking reminder that I was, once again, wide awake. After an hour of tossing and turning, I gave up. I got out of bed and decided to burn off some of this useless energy. My parents, knowing my struggles, had always encouraged my late-night walks. We live in a quiet, safe-as-it-gets residential area, and our backyard opens directly into a huge, sprawling public park. The main paths were always well lit by those tall, old-fashioned lamps that cast a warm orange glow on everything. A walk in the rain had become my go-to cure. Something about the cool air and the gentle rhythm of walking always seemed to quiet my mind. So I pulled on a rain jacket, slipped on my sneakers, and quietly let myself out the back door. I never took my phone. A phone screen was just another enemy of sleep. The air outside was surprisingly peaceful. It was a soft, steady rain, not a thunderstorm, and the world seemed washed clean. The orange lamplight glistened on the wet leaves and asphalt paths, and the gentle swaying of the trees was hypnotic. This was exactly what I needed. For the first 20 minutes, it was perfect. I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to release, the frantic energy in my brain finally starting to subside. I was actually getting tired. A good thing. I turned around and started the walk back toward my house, cutting across a large grassy field that bordered the main road running alongside the park. And that's when I saw it. Under the distant glare of a street light, there was a long, dark object lying flat in the middle of the street. At first, I figured it was just a couple of garbage bags that had fallen off a truck. But the more I stared, the more the shape resolved itself into something terribly familiar. It was a person. Just lying there, face down from the looks of it, completely motionless in the pouring rain. A sick, cold feeling bubbled up in my stomach, instantly erasing the peace I'd felt just moments before. My mind raced. They must have been hit by a car. That was the only logical explanation. Injured, or worse. Why else would someone be lying in the street during a downpour? My first instinct, my gut reaction, was to just turn around, to keep my head down, pretend I hadn't seen anything, and get back to the safety of my house. But I couldn't. My parents had raised me better than that. If you see someone who needs help, you help them. End of story. So, fighting every self-preservation instinct screaming at me to run, I started walking toward the road, my heart beginning to pound a nervous rhythm against my ribs. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The person was wearing black pants and a dark plaid shirt. Definitely not the kind of clothes you'd wear for a walk in a storm. Judging by the frame, it was a man. That's what I had already assumed. As I stepped off the grass and onto the wet asphalt, a strange thing happened. I suddenly became aware of how cold I was. It was bizarre. One second the rain had felt lukewarm, and the next it was like needles of ice against my skin. It was as if the gravity of the situation had physically changed the temperature of the world around me. I was about 20 feet away from the body now. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky. "Sir, are you okay?" No response. I took another hesitant step forward. "Sir, do you need help?" Just as the words left my mouth, a sound ripped through the night from the woods behind me. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a coyote. It was a high-pitched, guttural, unexplained howl that sounded like a wounded animal being torn apart, but it was wrong. There was a metallic, unnatural quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. Instinct took over. I whipped my head around, my veins flooding with adrenaline as I scanned the dark tree line. The sound had come from deep within the park, but there was nothing to see but shadows and rain. The sheer strangeness of it all had my heart racing. I had never heard anything like it in my life, and it was the lack of an explanation that triggered that first wave of pure, uncut fear. But that feeling was about to get 1,000 times worse, because when I turned back around to face the street, the person wasn't lying down anymore. He was sitting perfectly upright, his back still to me, as if he'd been pulled up by invisible strings. And then, slowly, he turned his head. He looked right at me, and he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a wide, impossibly stretched grin that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were dark, hollow pits. It was a purely demonic smile, a mask of predatory glee. In that moment, the world started to fade. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, the only things in focus being that horrifying face and the muffled sound of 1,000 raindrops pattering all around me. I think I was about to faint. Before I could react, before I could even scream, he stood up in one fluid, unnatural motion, and I saw what he was holding in his right hand, a kitchen knife. The blade caught the streetlight, gleaming a wet, silver promise of death. Up until that moment, I didn't know what it truly meant to fear for your life. He started sprinting towards me, that monstrous smile never leaving his face. The spell was broken. I snapped out of my haze and ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction, back towards the park. As soon as I started running, I heard him yell at the top of his lungs, the words cutting through the rain. "I'll kill you." The wet grass was slick and treacherous, making it impossible to run at full speed. My sneakers slipped and slid, my ankles threatening to buckle with every step. But I had one small advantage. He had to deal with the same slick grass. I didn't want to lead him to my house. I couldn't. My parents were home, asleep. The only other option was the trees, the dark, dense woods where that unearthly howl had just come from. I know. Insane, right? But I didn't have another choice. I didn't look back once. Not once. I just ran like my life depended on it. Which, considering the cracked-out, murderous look on that guy's face, I'm pretty sure it did. I pumped my arms and legs, my lungs burning, my only focus being the dark maw of the woods ahead. I hoped, I prayed, that I could lose him there. I didn't even know if he was still chasing me, but I didn't care. Part of me felt like if I stopped running, the fear itself would catch up and my heart would just explode. I made it into the woods, crashing through low-hanging branches that whipped at my face. Just as I felt the acidic burn of vomit rising in my throat from sheer exhaustion, I ducked behind a massive oak tree and tried to catch my breath, my chest heaving with ragged, painful gasps. I peered back the way I came. There was no one. At least, no one I could see. The only thought on my mind was how in the world I was going to get home safely. I didn't feel comfortable moving. What if he was out there, just waiting? So I waited. I must have stood there, shivering and soaked, for at least 20 minutes before I finally found the courage to step out from behind that tree. I took the long way home, circling around the backside of the park, through a section of woods that spit me out on a street several blocks from my house. No one followed me. He finally collapsed on his bed, the words "I'll kill you" echoing in his ears, drowned only by the phantom sound of that inhuman howl from the woods. He never found out who the man was, or what made that sound. He survived by running, but for a woman named Clara, alone in the vast Northern California wilderness, running wasn't an option. Story 7. The Camera in the Woods. Clara came to the woods to escape a broken heart. She never imagined she'd have to fight for her life instead. My thing has always been solo camping, not in a designated campground with families in RVs and neatly manicured fire pits. I'm talking about true remote wilderness camping, the kind you can only find in the forgotten pockets of Northern California, where the dirt roads have no names and the only sounds are the river and the wind. It's the only place I can go to truly clear my head. And God, did my head need clearing? I had just gone through a brutal breakup, the kind that hollows you out and makes you question everything. I needed to be alone. So, one day, I just packed my truck, threw my gear in the back, and headed for a quiet riverside spot I'd found a couple of years back. The plan was simple. No plan. Just me, a book, my tent, and the river. But the second I turned off the highway onto the barely there dirt path that led to the river, my stomach sank. Parked near the trailhead where the path disappeared into the trees were two pickup trucks, one gray and one white. My heart deflated. So much for solitude. The entire point of driving 3 hours into the middle of nowhere was to not have to interact with people. I sat in my truck for a full minute, debating whether I should just turn around and find another spot. But I told myself it was a big stretch of river. Chances were, whoever owned those trucks was camped far enough away that I'd never even see them. I pulled on my pack and started hiking downriver. About 15 minutes in, I saw them, 2 guys, fishing up ahead. They looked exactly like the type you'd expect to see out here. Thick beards, a little overweight, heavy boots. But something was off. They seemed less focused on fishing and more on something else. As I got closer, one of them, I'll call him the Watcher, saw me coming, and he quickly moved to cover something on the ground with his jacket. He gave me this awkward, forced half smile as I approached. "Howdy," he called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "Don't mind us. Just doing some target practice on some cans. Didn't mean to freak you out if you heard any shots." I hadn't heard anything. I just gave a polite nod, not breaking my stride. "No problem," I said, and kept walking. But his words replayed in my head. It wasn't just what he said. It was how rushed and clumsy it came out. Like he was trying way too hard to sound casual, to give me a prepackaged explanation for something I hadn't even questioned. It was the kind of lie that draws more attention than the truth. I got that uneasy feeling you get when a story doesn't quite add up, but I pushed it down. People out in the sticks weren't exactly known for their social skills. It wasn't that weird for rural folks to be a little off with strangers. I told myself to let it go. I found a spot a little further down the bend, where the trees were thicker and the trail dipped out of sight from where they were. It wasn't perfect, but it was tucked away enough that I felt like I had my own space. I set up my tent, pulled out my book, and tried to settle in. Not long after, a light rain began to fall, a soft drizzle that pattered against the leaves. Perfect. I threw on my rain jacket and let the sound of the river and the rain drown everything else out. Later in the afternoon, feeling a bit raw from my breakup, I wandered down to the rocks by the river's edge to just sit and think. That's when I saw him again, across the water, maybe 50 yards away. It was the Watcher. This time, he was alone. He spotted me and waved. I hesitated, my internal alarm bells ringing faintly, but then I waved back. Better to be friendly, right? No need to make things weird. He yelled something across the churning water that I couldn't quite hear. "What?" I shouted back. I said, "What's your name?" he yelled. I don't know why I did it. Every instinct I had was telling me to lie, to ignore him, to walk away. But in that moment, politeness won out over intuition, a mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life. "Clara," I shouted back, my own name feeling foreign and stupid as it left my lips. He stood there for a second after I answered, just staring. Then, he reached into his jacket and pulled something out. At first, I thought it was a phone, but then I realized it was smaller, blockier. It looked more like a disposable camera. Before I could even process what was happening, he held it up, aimed it at me, and I saw the flash. He took a picture of me from across the river. And then, without another word, Without another wave, he just turned and started walking back up the riverbank, disappearing into the trees like nothing had happened. I was beyond creeped out. I was violated. The weird excuse about target shooting was one thing, but this, taking a picture of a strange woman alone in the woods, this was next level strange. This was stalker behavior. I immediately headed back to my campsite, my heart hammering against my ribs. My plan to stay for a couple of days was officially canceled. I decided I'd just stay put for the rest of the night and pack up first thing in the morning. After the sun went down, the darkness out there felt absolute. I crawled into my tent and tried to get some sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. The breakup, the weird fisherman, the camera flash, it was all swirling in my head. I lay there for hours, just listening to the river and the light patter of rain against the tent fabric. At some point, though, I started hearing something else. Faint, uneven sounds, like someone stepping carefully over wet ground. A snapped twig here, a soft squelch of mud there. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. The rhythm was wrong. It was the sound of footsteps, 2 of them, and they were circling my campsite. Slowly, deliberately. The second I made that connection, my stomach dropped straight through the ground. I didn't even have to wonder who it might be. I'm no fool. I never go into the remote wilderness alone without protection, and this trip was no exception. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the side pocket of my backpack where I kept my handgun. My fingers closed around the cold, familiar grip. Then, taking a deep, shaky breath, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the rain. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but my hands were steady. I needed to stay calm. I clicked on my flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. I swept it across the trees surrounding my little clearing. And there he was. The Watcher. He was standing maybe 20 yards away, half hiding behind a thick pine tree. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He just had this utterly blank, vacant expression on his face, like he wasn't all there mentally. The scariest part wasn't his demeanor, though. It was what he was holding in his left hand. A small axe, its head glinting dully in the beam of my flashlight. For a second, I couldn't move. All I could think about was how far I was from anyone. How nobody would even hear me scream if it came to that. But then, training and adrenaline took over. I raised the gun, leveling it at the center of his chest. I forced my voice to stay even, though every part of me was screaming. "Leave now," I said, my voice cutting through the night, colder and harder than I thought possible. "Or, I will kill you." His blank expression didn't change. It was like my words were in a different language, or maybe just meant nothing to him. He just stood there, the rain dripping from his hair, the small axe held loosely at his side. After a few seconds of terrifying silence, he mumbled something. It was low and gravelly, hard to understand. "What?" I demanded, my finger tightening on the trigger. He looked past me, not at me, and mumbled again, a little clearer this time. "My friend, Ivan. He told me not to. He said I shouldn't come find you." He paused, his eyes finally meeting mine, and they were chillingly empty. I had to take care of Ivan. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I didn't want to know what take care of meant. I fired a shot straight into the trees just above his head. The bang was deafening, ripping through the quiet woods. He stumbled back, more out of surprise than fear, his blank expression finally cracking. He clearly hadn't expected me to actually do it. I leveled the gun at him again, feeling a surge of confidence. "It's your last chance," I said, my voice shaking a little less now. "Drop the axe." It did. It fell from his hand with a soft thud onto the wet ground. A huge wave of relief washed over me. But I wasn't out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. "Now take off your shoes," I commanded. He hesitated, then slowly complied. "Throw them over there." I pointed with the flashlight beam deep into the woods. Once I was sure he wasn't armed, I made a decision. I told him to go to my tent and grab my gear. I watched him like a hawk as he fumbled with my stuff, forcing him to toss it all out into the open where I could see it. I packed the essentials as fast as I could, never letting him out of my sight. My gun trained on him the entire time. I wasn't leaving my tent, but it was a small price to pay. I jammed his discarded axe into my backpack, grabbed his shoes and threw them as far as I could into the darkness. "Walk," I told him, pointing in the opposite direction of the trail. "Now." I kept the light on him the whole time, walking backward myself. The moment he walked far enough to be swallowed by the night, I turned and started hiking back up the river as fast as I could. That was the scariest part of the whole encounter, stumbling through the pitch-black forest in the rain with a potential murderer somewhere behind me. When I finally made it back to the pullout, both pickup trucks were still there. I didn't stop. I threw everything into my truck and sped out of there, tires spitting gravel. As she sped away, the man's final words haunted her. He had to take care of Ivan. She looked in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights, but there was nothing but darkness and rain. But what do these chilling encounters truly leave behind? Long after the rain has stopped and the immediate danger has passed, the night has carried us through 7 doors. 7 stories whispered across the threshold of sleep. Perhaps you've drifted into dreams by now, or perhaps you are still awake, staring into the dark and listening for echoes. Remember, not every ending is final. Sometimes the house remains long after you leave. Sometimes the reflection keeps smiling when you've already looked away. And sometimes, when you wake in your own bed, you might not be certain whether you've truly returned. For now, let go. Let the silence take you, as gently as the fog takes the road. Sleep well, if the night allows it. Good night.